Okay, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. It's just gone 9 o'clock, so we'll get started. As you probably all know, we have a guest tonight. We're going to be joined by Michael Kofman, who is one of the leading experts on Russian force structure. He may join us in a few minutes, so we're going to get started with the usual background materials to get the room warmed up, and then hopefully we'll bring Michael up in just a moment. So actually, I see that he's joined us. But I will get started just with the introduction while we all get set up on stage. So thanks very much for joining us. For those who don't know, ours is a space that covers developments in the news. We use a lot of mainstream sources, but then we heavily accent those with open source material, a lot of which we get from great accounts that are here on Twitter. In addition to reviewing the news for OSINT material and in connection with the war in Ukraine, we also try to present tools and techniques so that whether you're new to working with open source material or you've been at it a while, hopefully we can bring everybody's skill level up together. And then we will often have good speakers, people who are working on OSINT projects who will come in and share their work with us. The hope is that by finding good ongoing projects that we can build a little bit of collaboration. So these spaces rely fairly heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where individual tweets, links to tweets can be put. And so if you were, for example, to scroll to the far right-hand side of the nest, you'll see that that's the invitation for tonight's space. If you were to click through to that, you'll see that below that is our agenda for tonight. It's a thread that has links to the sources for almost all of the update materials that I'll share. The reason I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for what I present to you, but you have the source there. That way, if a subject interests you, you can always take it away as reading material. You can also look ahead in the agenda so that when we get to the section on updates, if any of them catch your interest and you have a question or a comment, you can join us. And you can always do that by requesting the microphone, which is the button in the bottom left-hand side of the Spaces window. And if you are enjoying the conversation, then we'd like to get as many people listening and engaged as possible. So please consider retweeting the space, and you can do that by hitting the button in the bottom right-hand side of the Spaces window. Okay, so usually the way I proceed is for about 10 minutes, I present some of the resources and the good examples of OSINT work from the last few days. This material is almost all drawn from our last conversation. And by the way, we hold these talks every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So I'll run through a handful of the materials. I'm starting at the far right-hand side of the nest at the moment. So that first tweet is just the invitation to tonight's space. By the way, for those who follow me, apologies if I reposted several times. There was a glitch as I was posting the thread and it froze on me. As a result, we don't have an invitation tweet up yet for our next conversation on Sunday night, but hopefully we'll get one put up before the end of the space so that you can all set a reminder for that. I'll also note that friends of ours are streaming this conversation to YouTube as well. I'd suggest that you participate here on Twitter if you can, because that's how you can join the conversation with a question or comment. But if you ever miss a talk, or if you remember something that we discussed and you'd like to go back and revisit it, you can always go to that YouTube channel and have a look at our posted conversations up there. And the link to the YouTube channels should be the first tweet actually in the left-hand side of the nest. But as I begin, I'm starting from the far right-hand side. The first tweet is the invitation to our space tonight. The second tweet has a link to a community calendar that we've developed. This is so that we can coordinate hosting for those who like to host spaces on Twitter about open source work and the war in Ukraine. For example, it includes the spaces held by our friends at Tochny on Sunday afternoons, just before our Sunday chat. We also decided to start putting conversations from outside organizations on, usually universities and think tanks, about the war in Ukraine, just because there are so many good talks that I was having trouble keeping track of them all, and even just identifying them. And so if you click through the link to the calendar, you'll see individual posts. If it's an upcoming event, there's usually a link to a registration page. If it's a past event, there's usually a recording. On that same tweet, second from the right, we also have several items of media from the last week. We usually identify podcasts. This week, it's some mixed media. And so if you have a look through it, there's a podcast prepared by Intelligence Squared, where they spoke with Ambassador Michael McFaul about Russia versus the West and how that will work after Putin, what to expect in West-Russia relations after Putin's no longer in the Kremlin. The second item in that tweet on calendar and media is a link to the podcast of the UK Defence Journal. They had a conversation. It's an episode of the OSINT Bunker, so it's the usuals, Defense Geek, Austin, and so on. This week they were speaking with Jacob Janowski, who works closely with Oryx. He's the one who's been posting the Oryx losses for the last several months, and they discuss challenges in collecting OSINT in the Ukraine war. The third podcast item is a talk put up by CSIS, where Elliot Cohn joined them to discuss an analysis of the Prigozhin putsch and how the U.S. should attempt to evaluate Putin's hold on Russia at the moment. The two bits of mixed media that are in there are the first of which is a tweet from Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor at The Economist. They put out a lengthy special feature this week on battlefield lessons learned from Ukraine. This tweet is not to that article alone, but in fact to a number of papers and studies that he used as source material in preparing that report. I thought it was particularly helpful, so I wanted to highlight it. Finally, an upcoming event that's OSINT related, the last tweet there is connecting to the OSINT Summit in 2023. And this is held by the SANS Institute. And interestingly, if you were to go onto YouTube and look up SANS or OSINT Summit 2022, 2021, they have videos of the proceedings available just up on YouTube. Lots of interesting talks there. This summit in 2023 is coming up on September the 8th. And I've heard from some folks that you might therefore need to book fairly quickly if you planned on attending that. So that's it for podcasts and those materials. Moving on to from the right-hand side, I'm now discussing sorry, just distracted here for a moment. I'm discussing the third and fourth items from the right. Just so you know, in the background, I just sent an invite to Mr. Kofman. So if you see that invite pop up on your screen, you can click to accept and join the stage. Otherwise, I think my co-hosts will coordinate with you just to make sure we can get you connected. And just a reminder that to join spaces, you have to do it on your phone. It will not work on a PC, just in case that's an issue. While we're getting that all set up in the background, looking at the third and fourth items from the right-hand side in the nest, these are some of the interesting resources from the last week. So if you were to look at the fourth item from the right, titled Resources, I'll put some of these up individually in the front of the nest. So the first block of material here is about some interesting ongoing mapping efforts. So the first is from our friends at GeoConfirmed, just reminding us that not only do they have mapping projects for the war in Ukraine, but they also have mapping efforts for several other conflicts around the world that lots of folks contribute to. So that should appear in just a moment as the first item in the nest. And just getting the materials up. The second item in the nest is a link to the Sudan map that's prepared by the Center for Information Resilience, led by Benjamin Strick. They also have several maps from around the world and coordinate closely with GeoConfirmed. So a reminder that that's a great resource, OSINT-wise. The third item back is a tweet from Ian Cox. There were several people who noted this in the last few days, that the Bing map, as opposed to Google Maps, actually has different imagery, slightly different quality. It's taken at different times of day, and it apparently has slightly higher resolution, as in you can zoom in more closely. So if you're working on geolocations and you're relying entirely on Google Maps, do remember that Bing Maps might be an interesting alternative. The last two items I added to the front of the nest as good resources from this last week were a tweet from Andrew Erickson, which is his latest edition of the Modern Chinese Maritime Forces, which is a great OSINT effort to build up materials on China's Navy. And then finally, just as a bit of an OSINT philosophical question, I put up a tweet there from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, where they had an interview with, I believe it was the head of UK intelligence, discussing how even with the increasing prominence of OSINT work, that certainly the secret intelligence remains an important part of the overall intelligence picture. Okay, so I think that we are all set now for our speaker. And so the other resources and so on, good examples from the past week, I'll get into once we've had our conversation with Mr. Kofman. So we're joined today by Michael Kofman. He's a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a role he just started in the last week or so. And he focuses on Russian military and Eurasian security issues. Just before that, he spent several years as the director of the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis, and is a colleague of our friend. He was a colleague of our friend Sam Bendet there. And so Mr. Kofman is a frequent speaker on Russian military matters, and he often speaks with War on the Rocks. And in fact, he hosts his own podcast there called The Russia Contingency. And so if you're interested to hear more of Mr. Kofman's thoughts after our discussion today, I'd encourage you to go to the War on the Rocks website or look on where you find your favorite podcasts and look for The Russia Contingency. So Michael, thanks very much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on your podcast.
So we have a lot of interesting questions that we've lined up from the audience that are a little bit more detailed about the war. But I thought I would take a few minutes in order to ask you some questions to introduce you to the audience so that we can understand some of your the factors that influence you and a little bit more about the type of work that you do. It seems that whenever I hear you on a podcast, people, jump, they're keen, they jump right into the military matters. And I think one result of that is sometimes they'll ask you lots of questions that are, they may be asking you things that aren't directly related to your areas of study, like the policy interests of the West or, specific production rates of military equipment and the like. But I understand that you were actually born in Ukraine, in Mykolaiv, and I listened to some of your recent talks, and I'm curious whether that background as a Ukrainian influenced your decision as you were starting your career to go into Russia studies at a time where you had described a lot of people as having written Russia off as essentially dead, or when you give this analysis or analogy of Russia being 4 feet tall or 12 feet tall, it was certainly a time when they were 4 feet tall. So did that factor into your career choice?
So I think probably being originally from Ukraine and from the Soviet Union, really, to be honest, from Soviet Ukraine, I left very early in the 1990s, and I generally don't claim myself to be Ukrainian because I don't think it's fair. I never really lived in independent Ukraine. But I did spend my childhood and younger years there. I think I always had a sort of interest in the area, obviously in the region that I'm from. I had that interest at a time where most of the focus was elsewhere. If your formative years studying were in the 1990s, then a lot of the interest in the field of international relations, international security, was focused on peacekeeping, peace enforcement, ethnic conflict, conflict management and settlement, and those types of issues. And if it was in the early to mid 2000s, then of course a lot of it was on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, stability operations, or what folks called low intensity conflict, right? And a lot of people converted to the war on terror. And so in that time period, there wasn't that much interest in not Russia area studies, but in general in Slavic and Eastern European studies, however you may frame it, right? So I was one of the people that maintained an interest, and yeah, I certainly think it's because I'm originally from the region. I think it helps me understand it somewhat. It helps to speak the language, or at least local languages. And I did a lot of my very early academic work on Russian wars in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. And these were not very interesting. A lot of people didn't study them back then. So I don't want to, since it's 9 p.m. for me, I can very easily lose my chain of thoughts. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm sure folks are interested in a lot of things beyond what interests me in area studies. But yeah, I'm originally from Kiev. This area is not foreign to me. I've followed a lot of wars, but this one in particular, I know many of the places.
Perfect. I was wondering if you could also describe for us what your area of expertise is. As I noted, sometimes people seem to be asking you, questions, about how will the war end, or they'll ask you, questions. I know you've been critical, for example, of Prigozhinology, or reading too many tea leaves into, the background in the Kremlin. So where does your work fall between international relations and, more of the military tactical side of things?
Oh, that's a good question. Boy, I wish I had an easy way to answer it. So if you define expertise, right, as areas that you both studied and worked on that you think you know something about, or at least enough to be a bit more than just a commentator, but to be able to effectively engage in a value-added conversation, and areas where you've done research studies, you've actually participated in some form of knowledge creation. I'd say probably at the intersection of the world of broadly speaking, sort of functional area of security studies, right? Looking at strategy, defense planning, military analysis, right? I've been applied pretty much all my life. I'm not really an academic. I used to joke that professionally, defense research, you're at best a sort of para-academic. And with a particular focus, maybe specialization, on the Russian armed forces, right? Military thought, strategy, operational art, capabilities, both conventional and nuclear. And that intersects where at least that intersects in the areas of military analysis I'm particularly interested in, which is conventional capabilities, operations, nuclear strategy, and what have you. And let's say, as opposed to what, much less so, let's say, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and my focus is not in China or Indo-Pacific, although I find most folks who are analysts and deal with Russia, and particularly if you're based here in the United States, are rather conversant in issues pertaining to China. You kind of have to be. It's very hard not to. But it requires fairly specific expertise and ideally language skills to have in your expertise in East Asian studies. So that's where I would put it. I am always rather interested in history and military history. I also like IR, and I do bore people on occasion who elicit this in sort of questions of international security and international relations. I'm a big fan of that as well. But yeah, my field is principally interdisciplinary. And for me, it's just good to be cognizant where you're engaging in a conversation and you think that you genuinely know something about the subject versus where you're engaging in some casual intellectual tourism. And that's okay too, as long as you understand what's happening.
Well, so you mentioned that you've been very practical through your career, and that it's interdisciplinary. And so I know that you have actually traveled to Ukraine several times during the war. And I was wondering, how have those visits influenced your thinking? And then when you are planning a visit like that, how do you make decisions about where to go, who to see in order to further your research?
Okay, well, the first question I think is pretty easy. It's very significant. I mean, getting into the country, engaging with people there, doing an actual field study to the extent that you can do such a thing in a war zone, it opens up just a great deal for you in terms of information. And there's a lot, at least if you have some experience, that you can see and tell with your own eyes. There's a lot that you can glean from conversations with people. There's a lot of data you can get that there's no other way to get, to be perfectly honest. You realize that consistently we know far less about the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian side of the story than we do about the Russian one. And a lot of the things I'm interested in are not just about what's happening today, that is, what's the current state of the battlefield, and those nuances, and plus a lot of those things are secret, and you should expect folks to be rather reticent to tell you about some of the details, but a lot of it actually has to do with the history of this conflict. What happened in the battle for Kiev, right? What happened in Kharkiv and in Kherson, and why does some of those things happen, and what were the different roles that different units played? Helping to reconstruct that history is very important to understand what is happening today and how to think about the future. Because usually when a war, you don't know what's going on. And a lot of the early reports are wrong, and entire narratives get built on erroneous data and faulty information, and you kind of had the sense of this battle and what happened, and you've already built in your mind a sort of a causal path as to what you think was the most important or most significant and what caused what. And then often over time you find out that that's just not true, and you need to fix that story. And if you believe something that's not true, you're going to be believing all sorts of things about what's happening in the world today that also aren't true, right? So it's very important to fix that in my mind. What else can I say? But as far as planning goes, I'm going to be a bit evasive on that, which is the plan for me has always been to be emergent and to see what the art of the possible is, given where you are and what is happening at that time in Ukraine. To me, the most important part of the plan is to know what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, to be careful not to engage in war tourism, all right, being there just for the sake of being there, and to try to get what you think is the most useful and the most helpful for your work and research and for the conversation writ large, but also to not get in the way, right? And that to me is kind of the ideal.
So I suspect that point you made about our having less insight
Mr.
into...
Bond, your microphone needs a reset real quick. I'll just take a quick moment to remind everybody that down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is the purple button, and that'll take you to the space link, and you can tweet that out and let other people know that we're in here and talking to Mr. Kofman, and maybe they'd like to join us too. Up above our heads, if you scroll to the very top, is what we call the nest, and that's where Mr. Bond has linked a whole bunch of different resources that we're going to talk about today, or that he's already talked about, some of the resources he mentioned earlier in the space. And so you can scroll right and left with those, and if you click on them, it'll take you to the link. Jacoby is kindly putting them down in the bottom right-hand corner, shared to the tweet for the space as well. So after the space is over, if you're looking for a resource that we've talked about, you'll be able to find them there. And I believe you're back, Mr. Bond. He may not be.
All right.
Sorry, I apologize for that. For those who don't know, I run this space on an emulator on a desktop in an effort to make the Wi-Fi connection more stable, or the internet connection more stable, but sometimes it generates errors in the mic, so I just have to reset it. Usually it happens about once per space, so apologies there. I suspect that theme you mentioned about having less information about the Ukrainian forces than the Russian forces is a theme that we'll touch on several times. And I also appreciated your point there about being careful not to build a narrative early on based on false data. And so that ties in a little bit to my next thought, which is that when you've taken these trips to Ukraine, I know that you've traveled along with some other well-known analysts, Rob Lee and Conrad Musica and several others. And I know that Rob and Conrad, they both have, affiliations with research institutes. They also do a lot of open source work, particularly Rob, posting material here on Twitter. And I know that from time to time in the last couple of months, you've been critical of OSINT efforts getting too far ahead of themselves. And so I'm curious what you think the role is in research into a war like this for open source, and when it goes astray in a way that you've criticized in the past.
Well, I think OSINT is an immense resource, right? It's kind of funny to me because I don't really remember my criticism of OSINT, but maybe they've come out in minor ways here and there. But it's clear that OSINT folks do, right? And my view of it is that the OSINT community is an invaluable resource. I talk to a lot of folks in this community on a daily basis, and it's really in many ways a hive mind. It's kind of a cluster of communities, which I find pretty fascinating. And I don't know what else to add there, except that I think OSINT is best when folks are collecting the data, doing mapping, getting the evidence, and are building very useful information resources, and they're building it as a composite picture by talking to each other and by verifying things. And so the community has, aspects of its own peer review. But, okay, let's be honest, there's, at least from my own perspective, there's lots of accounts that claim to be OSINT accounts that don't seem to do OSINT, in my point of view. There's a lot of accounts that just repost things, right, from wherever they find them, whether it's Telegram and Twitter. They write OSINT in the account, but they're not, they're not doing any open source analysis that I can tell. And there's a lot of accounts that I've seen that simply copy and borrow what other people post and write, and then kind of rewrite those things. And essentially, I'll be frank. In my profession, we call that plagiarism, but I don't know what it's called on Twitter in the OSINT community. And I've seen that, by the way, I've seen that a lot actually happen, not online here on Twitter, but even more so in the YouTube community. A lot of folks that run profitable YouTube channels take a lot of their ideas, a lot of the discussion off of Twitter, and a lot of the resources off of Twitter and off of podcasts, and combine them into a very good package and put that out as a good resource. And they're great, but these are things generated by other people. And I personally don't get upset at that, because I'm not I don't see myself as an OSINT account. There's no OSINT in the name of my Twitter account, and I don't pretend to be doing the kind of OSINT work that a lot of the other folks in the community are doing. To me, the best resources are probably those individuals that are working in a narrow lane and are working collaboratively. It works best as a network. A lot of folks sit together, talk together on Signal or through Discord or what have you. And what's not visible probably to a lot of people on Twitter is that it's kind of a hive mind. And so as a collaborative community, to me, it works great. It's kind of like its own organic analytical resource center of folks, none of whom are paid to do this. And everybody's spending an immense amount of time to do this. I think it's done wonders, and I've become more and more involved in it over the last couple of years, especially since the war began. But what else can I say on that subject?
Well, it's interesting to hear you highlight those two factors of the best work being done by those who are narrowly focused, and that it's about collaboration, because those are things that I'll harp on in our conversations. Is when we have great guests up, usually they've picked one subject to really specialize in, and then the whole point of our conversations is to bring those people together in a way that they can collaborate and learn from one another. So I know that we have a couple of friends here with us who have prepared questions. I have two for you just to get things started on questions about the war. So the first is that there is a debate that's going on right now about the degree of success of the Ukrainian offensive. And that was partly exemplified. There was a recent thread put up by Thomas Tyner, who's popular here on Twitter, where he talked about this being really only the first stage of the offensive, and that it's focused on attrition, and that because Ukraine doesn't have a lot of air power, it's slower than people are expecting in the West. And so his argument is that the offensive shouldn't be judged by recaptured terrain. But others, have come out and said, well, I think Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor at The Economist, has said this, that progress may be a little slower than they expected. And he talks about the concern about ammo consumption, and that they may have, a budget of ammo available to them for the offensive. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the pace of the offensive? Should we be judging it now? And if so, how do we judge it? Terrain, attrition, or otherwise?
Okay. So first, you have to have a criteria for success, right? And second, you have to ask yourself, are you judging the offensive based on your expectations or based on what you think the Ukrainian plans and expectations were, right? And how would you know what those are? Third, this conversation has revealed a real variance between analysts, I think, who expected this offensive to be difficult, costly, and rather fitful in progress, and whose expectations for it, particularly the initial period, were very conservative, and others who thought that this would be a lot easier, that Ukrainian forces would be able to cut through Russian defenses like a hot knife through butter for all sorts of reasons. I find it a bit ironic that Tyner's now explaining that actually here are all the reasons why it's going slower and we shouldn't expect it to go faster, since he was one of the principal advocates of the proposition that this would be very fast and rather easy. But okay. I will leave that conversation there. What I will say is that I think it's very clear that the offensive is going much slower than expected. It's so clear that even the president of Ukraine has said it publicly, all right? And so have others. Second, that in and of itself doesn't tell us as much. The question is, what are Ukraine's options? Where do they stand in terms of available combat power? Where does the Russian military stand on available combat power? Clearly, this has shifted from an initial assault that wasn't as successful as the Ukrainian military had hoped, right? And had not set up some of the things they probably hoped to set up in terms of being able to reach Russian main lines, breach them, and employ a substantial reserve to exploit that breach. But now that we're in a attritional phase, it just means that this offensive is going to go on for, as I said from the very beginning, not just weeks, but months. And some people recoiled at the proposition it would go on for months. But most offensives in this war have lasted 2 or 3 months, if not longer. And the way I kind of made an analogy is that, yes, this is a lot similar in some ways to the Kherson offensive, except it's much more difficult than the Kherson offensive was because of the geometry of the battlefield, the density of forces, the correlation, what have you. And it's likely going to alternate between prolonged phases of attrition of Ukraine trying to wear down Russian forces, trying to gain fire superiority, trying to attack Russian logistics and what have you, and attempts to push Russian forces and to advance the Russian defenses. That's the best I can do. Regarding Shawshank's comments, yeah, absolutely. I've probably been one of the people harping eternally on artillery ammunition and the significance of it. But the Ukrainian military uses fires decisively and then tends to exploit them. I mean, that's the reality of how a lot of this war has gone. Both sides have principally pursued an attritional approach in most cases, heavily leveraging artillery. And so artillery ammunition is like the sand in the hourglass, right? It's the real-time limitation on Ukraine's offensive, no matter how the Ukrainian military chooses to pursue it, because they received some amount of artillery ammunition to prosecute this offensive from the United States and other Western countries. We know this artillery ammunition in practice was borrowed from South Korea, some large percentage of it probably, based on what's out in the press. And that the rate at which they use artillery ammunition relative to what gains they make is a significant factor. Okay, that being said, this is why it might be useful to shift later in the conversation about DPICMs, because that is a very significant development for this offensive and for the conversation on artillery ammunition available to Ukrainian forces and to what extent the United States can eliminate any time pressure on them.
Well, that's an interesting point. And so following our conversation, if we have a balance of time, I'll go into updates. So I actually have some materials on the DPICMs. So I'll put those up in the nest for the audience to have a look at in a moment. And I'm sure that one of our questions down the road here will get to them. But my second question then is, since really you're talking about the combat capability of the two sides being the measure, there's been speculation about the idea of the Ukrainian attack to draw Russian reserves out into the fight, so that they're not, they're somewhat mobile, they're not entirely in fixed defense. There's also been discussion about the idea that Russia has begun to transfer some forces from the Kherson region, potentially over toward Bakhmut, where things are going a little bit more poorly for them. And so are questions now about, has Russia actually begun committing its reserves? If it has to be moving people around the front, does it still hold a reserve? I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? How would we judge if Russia has additional troops that they could move to respond to Ukrainian breakthroughs?
Okay. Well, I'll throw it back and say, it's up to the OSINT community to detect the deployments of particular units and try to identify them. But it's very difficult because, one of the biggest challenges in following this war is that pieces of a brigade, a battalion, or a battalion tactical group can be deployed on different parts of the battlefield, right? So it's very easy for anyone who's doing this to map the same brigade in 3 different places, right? And maybe all 3 of those are right. Or maybe 2 of those places are a battalion element each, and the rest of the brigade is parked somewhere else. So it's not that easy to know where things are and how much is being moved. So, yes, it's possible that elements of Russian airborne air assault brigades are being moved from the Dnipro grouping of forces down in Kherson, in part because they don't have a significant job to do. Basically, they are guarding. Yes, they're guarding against a cross-river operation, but a lot of that's been flooded and washed out, and most of what you see now is them fighting the small little beachhead that Ukrainian forces have established across the Antonovsky Bridge. But in general, those forces are available, right? I've not seen substantial shift or deployment of Russian reserves either along the Tokmak axis or the Velikonovosilka axis. But I could be wrong because information is often dated, at least what you end up working with. The strategic reserve there is probably, 7th Guards Air Assault Division, and it's typically the airborne. If they're redeploying them to Bakhmut, it's also clear why. Not the 7th, but some of these other units. It's because they're under heavy pressure in Bakhmut. They left relatively weaker units there, and it's possible that the 31st Air Assault had taken a lot of casualties in the fighting over the past month. But Bakhmut, I think, to me at least, Bakhmut always looked as a fixing axis. It was meant to try to strain Russian forces to set up opportunities in the south rather than the other way around. Like, Bakhmut is not strategically significant, just to be frank. I don't think most folks see it as such. It's politically significant to Ukraine, but the gains Ukrainian forces have made around Bakhmut's flanks, well, I can get into a whole separate conversation about Bakhmut. I've talked a lot about it over the past 6-7 months. But what it tells me right now is that, yes, Russian forces are their weakest around Bakhmut, but Bakhmut is also the least relevant front. If they shift forces there and they are heavily pressured in the south, then yes, they could be without a mobile reserve. On the other hand, I don't know if they really moved any units from 7th Guards Air Assault Division. I don't know that's really the case. And so far, let's be honest, Russian 58th Army is holding south of Orikhiv relatively stably. That is, they've given up ground incrementally, but things can change in war pretty quickly. So,
all of which is fair, and so you note that it's for the OSINT community to attempt to map locations. With regard to the idea that units can be distributed in multiple locations, I'll note that if people haven't engaged with any of the maps that show unit positions as well. So, for example, just the other day, somebody was asking me a question, I think it may have been David, who's in the audience here, about the location of a unit. And so some people may not know that you can actually search by unit names in some of these maps. So if I've put up in the nest a link to a number of maps, among those is the Project OWL effort UA control map. And that and 1 or 2 of the others have a search feature where you can punch in the unit name, and they'll indicate where they're located on the map primarily, but then they'll also have a notes section that shows their sources, so the references for movement around the country, which includes when units are split across multiple locations, as best as is known. So I'm just raising that for those who haven't actually played with those maps. Go and have a look at them. They do a fair bit of work there, even though it's a challenging thing to follow. So, and by the way, just for the audience's benefit, I did put up the material on DPICM, the DPICMs, that we'll get into in a bit in case you want to start looking at that. So we have a couple of friends of ours who have questions lined up. I'm going to go first to Random. And Random, I know you had two questions. I think one was about private industry versus public industry. And then the other were the comments of Radican recently in the media. Did you want to run with those?
Oh, yeah. So, hello, Michael. I've been following you since probably the start of the war when you and Dmitry Alperovich over at Silverado Institute were holding like a Twitter space every other night. I think that's when I first got introduced to you. But the thing that I was curious about was in the past week, and it's kind of gone under the radar, which is you have kind of the tale of the two ex-Soviet industries where we were talking about Ukraine and Russia, where you have on one side you have Ukhraniabornprom. I hope I said that right. I've been butchering those names all day. Basically heading towards more of a privatization and changing their from a state-owned conglomerate, but at the same time, you've had Rostec, the main state-owned company in Russia, announced that they were transferring a bunch of Euro Vengadzavod's subsidiaries and other industries to Techmash to focus more on tank production, I believe. And I was wondering, given the field where you have Russia heading more towards the more state-owned situation and Ukraine heading more towards a privatized situation, what you make of the two arms industries in the near future?
Yeah, broad question. So on the Russian side, yeah, Rostec basically is a state-controlled conglomerate with a fairly sizable percentage of the overall Russian military-industrial complex. In it, I think you're going to see just an expansion of state control. I think that the Russian military found themselves off in a pretty bad way when you look at the shutdown of a whole number of vehicle repair facilities. Many of the plants or these facilities were basically in bankruptcy or near bankruptcy. And I suspect that the Russian Ministry of Defense, the military, has taken over a number. And Rostec probably, this is just speculation right now, is going to take UVZ. UVZ is always kind of in bad shape financially. Part of it has always been their flagging rail wagon business, the commercial side of the house. Part of it has just been the shakeout of negotiating orders with the Ministry of Defense. So they've always, I think, been kind of in an anemic state. But yeah, I think probably they're going to try to focus some of these different plants on specific types of production as they look to mobilize and ramp up the defense sector. And they are likely going to increase production. I mean, that's the reality. It may go slowly, but I suspect we will see increases in their ability to take things out of storage, have gap to generate more equipment. A lot of it will be old because of throughput. You see the consistent problem, at least I've observed over years of following the Russian defense industry, is in defense industrial capacity. It's throughput, right? People always focus on the money, but the problem they've consistently had is there's a lot of games being played with money, but if the money was there's still big problems with throughput, inefficiencies, lack of skilled labor, and big choke points in the supply chain for making this equipment. On the Ukrainian side, I'm just not as knowledgeable on Ukrainian defense industry. I've tried to stay current on it here and there. I know Ukhraniabornprom's had their own share of woes. I think that privatization is definitely in some ways a better model. Of course, it depends on what that means. But meaning with privatization, it often depends on who owns it and who the main stakeholders are. But in general, I think Ukrainians also benefit from the fact that they had a very robust defense sector, and parts of it survived. I think a lot of it had to survive on export orders prior to 2014 and after 2014 as well, as you saw a lot of the equipment being used, like anti-tank guided missiles, were were programmed in Arabic language in 2022 because they're clearly meant for export to other markets. And, I think that the defense sector in Ukraine is definitely resilient. I've been pretty impressed with what they've been able to do in onlining repair of Western equipment, in being able to put into action captured Russian equipment, but also faces a host of new challenges that are distinct to the situation Ukraine finds itself in, which is working with a large and variegated park of Western equipment they've inherited without good documentation, maintenance records, and without necessarily the licensing or the intellectual property agreements to be able to build parts and do other things. So there's like a host, I know there's a myriad of complications there that Ukraine is trying to work through.
Random, I think you were also curious about Radican's comments. Did you want to just phrase that?
Yeah, that was just as a follow-up, is that obviously there was the interview in the Financial Times from Admiral Radican in the UK talking about the sustainability and the losses suffered by the Russian forces. So like Radican came out and said that the UK expects that the Russians have lost half their combat force. They expend 10 million artillery shells and only have the capacity for 1 million a year, and then only have the capacity for 200 tanks per year. So, and judging from the fact that we're talking about Ural ramping up production of tanks, but the follow through and the flow through and that lack of skilled labor is a big issue for the Russians. I was just wondering what you made of his comments and what you've seen so far in the expenditures of like the old Soviet stockpiles.
Yeah, so the problem with those figures when people put them out is, were they measuring as the total Russian force, right? Because the Russian force keeps regenerating with additional material, manpower, and to a lesser extent munitions, right? So I often hear erroneous comparisons, first to what the initial invasion force was, and second, these sort of abstract numbers that are doing a lot of lifting. And I don't know what to make of them, to be perfectly honest. So I think a 10 million artillery shell figure seems a bit high, but over the course of, let's say, 16 months, that could be a very high range of estimate for how much the Russian military has used. How much did they have to start with? That was always a fairly active debate in the community. How much can they make per year? Is it 1 million? Is it 1 million based on today's figures? Or is it 1 million based on where they were, I don't know, whenever these estimates were made? Was it potentially going to increase to 6 months from now? If it's 1 million, that's not a lot, but that's actually quite a bit, right? Because that means that actually if Russia makes, let's say, 1 million artillery shells a year, and let's say they spend 1 million artillery shells in the year, which is a fraction of what they fired so far in this war. And let's say that allows them to sustain somewhere shy or close to a fires rate of, 3,000 artillery shells per day. That's quite a bit. That's probably the average artillery use rate for the Ukrainian forces for a large part of this war. So, my first instinct as an analyst, whenever I hear numbers, especially numbers given by senior military officials, which were given to them by somebody else, okay, is where are they coming from? What are the totals that this is a share of? And very significantly, compared to what? Like, what are these numbers compared to other numbers that we know? I mean, does that make any sense? So, what should we make of them? Because numbers have to be interpreted. They don't do the talking by themselves.
Yeah, you're right, especially about who's given, like, where are they getting these numbers from. Michael, thank you for answering my questions. Obviously, I have like infinite more, but if for the sake of time, I'm going to hand it off back to Michael Bond.
Yeah, no, sure. But I'll just add, so 1 million artillery shells for Russian fire rate, as it has been this war, is a fairly small amount. But also, if you think the sustainable fire rate for Ukrainian forces has been around maybe 90,000 artillery shells per month, not during the offensive, for which they need a lot more, but let's say on average, and they've typically fired over the course of, let's say, winter, fall, when not on the offensive, around 3,000 shells per day of let's say main caliber types, right? Because always then the question, well, what are we counting? Are we counting all artillery types? Are we counting mortars? Are we just counting 155, 152? Bottom line, well, 1 million shells is about what that use rate would look like in a year. I mean, it's a bit more than that, but that already as a number tells you something that's very important, which is the Russian military will have to ration artillery ammunition, and it will lack the fire's advantage to have significant offensive potential. It gives us something useful to work with. But it also should tell you that the Russian military isn't going to run out of artillery ammo, and that the relative advantage that Ukraine will be able to establish in quantity will not be that significant. So it will probably have to be in quality.
Thanks for that. And related to that, I put up in the nest, it's not on the artillery front, it's on the equipment front. There was a report that was put out by Bloomberg today that caught some attention here online, suggesting that Ukraine may have more tanks now than Russia does. But this goes to Michael's point about, specific numbers are very hard to come by. And so I've put in the nest the response from Jimmy Rushton, who's thoughtful OSINT work here on Twitter, essentially saying, it would be great if this was true, but we just, on the amount of information that we have, it's very hard to be certain. And I know I went away and looked at the numbers, and they had suggested Russia had 3,700 tanks, which I understand was the estimate of tanks that they had in service at the beginning of the war, but doesn't account for tanks and storage. It's just very hard to be that precise.
Yeah, can I just jump in? I think that's a high number for the tanks that the Russian military had in active service in the beginning of the war. I personally probably would have given them 2,700 plus a couple hundred in the LDNR units, maybe with a rough ballpark up to 3K. But my own personal view is not more than that at the beginning of the war, with a significant amount in storage, but heavily debated, what that amounts to. I've seen some good attempts by OSINTers to individually count those tanks on satellite as pixels. It's pretty interesting work. I don't know. I didn't read this Bloomberg story. If the idea is that Ukraine has as many tanks in service as Russia does in general in its armed forces, I'm skeptical. If it's on the battlefield in Ukraine, then yeah, that's quite possible, but it depends what you're counting. Let me just give my own impression, and this is just from my own experience in Ukraine. I don't think I've ever encountered a Ukrainian unit that had a tremendous amount of operational tanks and that felt great about the tanks they had relative to need, okay? So there can be a lot of tanks on paper, but the parts required to keep these things going are always a challenge. And tanks get their barrels worn out. There are issues with tank ammo. And so just counting tanks by numbers on Excel spreadsheets, as I like to say, Excel spreadsheets don't fight. So that by itself doesn't tell you a complete story. But what I'll say is that I think that Ukraine obviously is a much better place with Western supplied armor than where it was prior to the spring, but I don't think they're flush with tanks, at least not tanks that are actually operationally ready and serviceable in units. And I've read a lot of stories that gave me pause about epic tank battles here and there with units involved in those battles that I know had very few operational tanks and that there were no real tank battles to speak of.
Yeah, as you say, it's interesting how those narratives become built up, and I do hope that I think the Bloomberg article is right in direction, although as ascribing very specific numbers as they have is a little bit harder to be confident in. But we have more questions. I know that Stephen had, I think, 2 questions. You mentioned, Stephen, you had a question about Ukrainian troop rotation, and then I think you had a more personal question about training to get into this field. Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Michael. So my first question would be, what would be the best path to kind of begin a career in international relations or conflict studies for someone who has yet to go into higher level education? So is it better to commission as an officer or study something specific? I think I'll just let you answer that before I go on.
Don't know. So, look, my view is that you can pursue this in any number of ways. Some things it's better to do younger than when you're older. I'll say that from life experience. Okay. So if you want to do military service, or if you want to pursue an academic career with a PhD, I recommend that early on rather than later for all sorts of reasons. But in general, there are lots of entry points into this, okay? I see folks that typically have a range of careers where they reinvent themselves. A lot of it is about adaptability. You may go from a research position to somewhere in government, to a think tank, to an academic institution, to an organization, to all sorts of things. And the order in which you do them isn't deterministic to me. So I know that's not a great answer, but if you're talking about how to get into the field, well, I mean, to be honest, it depends what you want to do in it, right? So I'm going to answer the question with a question. If you want to work in research and defense analysis, then I recommend education first with a host of experiences at defense research organizations. If you want to go the military route, you can do that too. But military experience is not a substitute for working in defense research analysis, just to be clear. Yeah, they're not equivalent substitutes. And just to be frank, as someone who's looked through a sizable number of resumes in my own life and has hired analysts in a defense research program, not all experience is to some extent useful, but not all of it's interchangeable. So it depends on what you want to do. And quite possibly you may not know what you want to do right now, and you don't have to.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. And so my second question is more about the AFU. So I was wondering, this is a topic we kind of hear mentioned, but I very rarely see specifics on it. How is the state of force rotation in the AFU? So do you think it's performed often enough? Because I often hear stories, because I do translations for War Translated. So we sometimes hear stories from Ukrainian units that are a bit fatigued. And how are the units rotated? Is it done when a whole brigade is pulled out of the front line, or is it kind of done on a lower level, on a battalion or a company level? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So I think it varies, to be honest. First, generally, I think that since the Russian winter offensive and the Ukrainian summer offensive, a lot of units are fatigued, particularly probably in and around Bakhmut. I think that in some cases, you have entire brigades that are rotated to another sector, and that sector is supposed to be more quiet, right? In other cases, you have battalions pulled out of a brigade, or the brigade is basically just operating in a particular area as 1 or 2 battalions, and the rest of it is somewhere else, trying to be reconstituted. You see supplements with TDF attachments. You see a sustained mobilization effort with mobilized personnel getting some set amount of weeks of basic training, and then some of them get sent off abroad to the various Western-run training programs. and then cycled back to units. United States has a separate program of training entire battalions. So these are presumably pulled out of brigades and then or built out for a brigade. Unfortunately, my view is honestly varies. It depends on the type of unit, and it depends on where they are in this war. I've heard all sorts of different stories. I do think that there's a lot of fatigue, and I've seen it. I saw quite a bit of fatigue in Kherson in October too. To be honest, a lot of the units there had been fighting through the summer and had been in that offensive for 2 months at that point. And I saw some of the same in and around Bakhmut, and have heard quite a bit since then from folks in Ukraine that there's a good deal of fatigue. Obviously, it's such a terrible grind. It's very difficult to replace losses, generate additional forces, and have an offensive that's spread along 3 axes, where in a number of cases you're pushing with units that have been deployed in that area and have been fighting in that area for several months.
Well, thanks for that. I know our friend Zodiac had a question about the effect of strikes on logistics, Russian logistics. Zodiac, did you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. So my question is that leading up to this and many other offensives, Ukraine has prioritized logistical strikes, particularly against bridges and rail hubs and that. And I'm curious of what your thoughts might be on how that might affect the Ukrainian armed forces going forward as they retake territory, and how that might affect their ability to quickly retake territory, and how that might impede their progress.
Okay, wait. Was the start of the question that this is something that Russia does, or
no? That the Ukrainians are hitting those logistics. Sure. So they hit the bridges, for example. Now they're gone. So now, as they move forward, they recapture those areas in the future, but those bridges are still gone. How well do you think the Ukrainians are prepared to deal with those logistical challenges that they've forced upon themselves due to the nature of offensive operations?
Okay, I get it. Okay, so first, believe it or not, I think one of the things that's most surprising about this offensive is we actually haven't seen that much of it. If you think about how long into the offensive before we saw the first real Storm Shadow strike against a Russian bridge along a ground line of communication coming out to Crimea, right, to the Chongar Strait, it was pretty far into it. You would have expected to see that potentially earlier on. I think just my own anecdotal impressions. It was definitely an issue in Kharkiv because Ukrainian units are constrained on bridging. That equipment is typically not available or not in the brigades that are conducting an initial assault anyway. So it's very easy to suddenly fall into a choke point where you have to wait for bridging units, and you can lose momentum. My impression, and look, this is not a comprehensive picture of the offensive in Kharkiv, is that one of the reasons why Ukrainian forces had to slow down and Russian units had the ability to recover and try to hold on Liman, at least for a bit, was for lack of bridging. And so this is a perpetual issue, and it's not just the lack of it, it's the fact that it's not necessarily going to be in the units that are in the lead. And then, or potentially they have one bridging unit, and now everybody has to go through one bridge, okay, that's been laid down. And the bridges are usually taken out everywhere. When I was in Kherson, good luck finding an original bridge anywhere around there. And this is just traveling around the existing service roads behind the lines. So it is a significant challenge. On logistics, I mean, that's a secondary question. So again, you've seen that the Russian military has adapted, largely driven by HIMARS strikes starting in late June of last year, And they have reorganized logistics. They made it harder to find. There are far fewer concentrated points. If you look at Ukrainian successes with strikes against major ammunition dumps with Storm Shadow, you have very few. You have one major one over the course of well over 40 days. It's very different compared to what the situation was when HIMARS was first introduced. So it's not just a get a longer stick problem. Yeah.
Well, so to follow up on that, I've seen some people say, why would Ukraine be hitting ammo dumps with Storm Shadow a month into the counteroffensive having been running? And some have pointed to it and said, well, there were such a high rate of HIMARS strikes when HIMARS were first received. Perhaps this is indicating that the available inventory of Storm Shadow is low and they're saving it till later. An alternative theory that I just put it up in the nest, the tweet by Bryn Tannehill, is essentially that Ukraine, because of strikes, has created so much pressure on Russian logistics that they've actually had to begin moving their ammo dumps a little further forward. So we saw some additional ammo dumps struck just last night, for example, so that it's not so much a lack of Storm Shadow or HIMARS as it is pressure on Russian logistics, and therefore they're moving them forward. Do you have any opinion as between those two?
Yeah, so I think the first one's wrong. That's just my own interpretation. I don't think it's for lack of Storm Shadows. I think it's for lack of good targets. Another thing I would say, by the way, and this is a comment to the OSINT committee, not every place where you see a bunch of rockets lying around in between buildings is an ammo dump. Yeah, there's a big difference. Like, very quickly, when any ammunition gets hit, it is an ammunition depot. Okay, that's not the case. So, yeah, and on a battlefield like this, you're always going to find some place where an artillery unit has either gotten lazy or has got caught up in the open, dumping ammo or transferring ammo, or having too many rockets stacked in advance of maybe preparing to fire something else, or and it's going to make for a significant explosion. But not every batch of rockets that you find lying in between buildings are a major ammunition depot, especially fairly close to the line, very far forward. Second point. Yeah, so I think what's been happening is Russian military has actually dispersed a lot of these points. There are far fewer significant ammunition pickup and drop-off points, and they're shifted around. There's a lot that's shipped in via trucking and transferred to military trucks. Other, obviously, by rail, and I think that's the main ammunition transfer point that got caught a couple of weeks ago down south in Kherson. But this challenge, it was visibly a greater challenge than just getting Ukraine longer range a couple of months after HIMARS were introduced. And the problem was really finding the targets and finding them in time to be able to service them. Right? That's my view of it. And I believe, this is my own interpretation, that if this was easy, we would be seeing a lot more ammunition dumps or transfer points going up in flames for a very particular reason. After the first week, or let's say 10 days, this offensive was moved into an attritional phase where Ukraine is trying to establish fire superiority, degrade Russian artillery, perhaps to put themselves in a position to be able to make another significant push, okay? So this is when striking Russian ammunition logistics depots would be the most useful, and is also when the Russian military would be the most strained to both sustain a rate of fire and also effectively disperse the logistics network, right? It's hard to do both, right? That's what you find. A lot of great operational concepts don't check in with logisticians to find out if they can make any of that stuff work, right? So this is where you find often challenges where it's much easier to do this when you're not significantly pressured by an opposing force that's driving to some extent the pace of operations. Anyway, so that's my view of it. I think that it's just much harder to find these. There are fewer larger ammunition depots or ammo dumps or what have you. and that this will become a harder target to track down. Yes, there will be strikes that hit Russian ammunition, but I'm not looking at Excel spreadsheet in front of me right now, but I'm confident that if you go and look at what the first 60 days of HIMARS strikes look like from late June into August compared to what the situation has been with Storm Shadow, you'll find it quite different.
Well, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. John, I think you had some questions about counter battery fire.
Yes, I did. Thank you for joining us, Michael. I wanted to ask you, especially in light of the newly announced DPICM deliveries, given the pervasive counterfire threat, particularly the threat of Ukrainian counterfire, I'm very curious if you have any insight into, I guess this is two alternative and related questions, either the organizational changes that Russia has implemented to better execute counterfire missions, or I guess in reverse, organizational changes that they've implemented to mitigate the threat of Ukrainian counterfire missions.
Okay. So on the first one, I mean, you saw the Russian military really begin to deploy and try to at least operate more the way they trained and organized to fight all the way back in April of 2022, where they started to separate units into main battery for support and dedicated counter battery with counter battery radars, start engaging in tactics to try to bait artillery into fire, into revealing its positions so that the counter battery can then engage them. And Ukrainian forces very much doing the same thing, to be clear. In sort of what I saw or heard is they also have units that are often separated into main battery support and counter battery fire on the battlefield. I think what's become a widespread tactic that started in 2022 is the Russian military using Lancet-3 munitions for counter battery fire. And this has started to proliferate and has expanded in the course of Ukraine's offensive right now over the course of the summer. And it's probably one of the biggest things that you hear Ukrainian units complain about. That being said, there are, of course, countermeasures to the Lancet-3, a whole number of ones. I mean, it can be shot down. Some of these types of drones can be interdicted with effective netting. Doesn't work in all cases, but does work in some. On the Russian side regarding artillery use, so in the winter, I think it was clear that the Russian military generally wasn't that concerned with Ukrainian counter-battery fire because there was a general state of shell hunger across the battlefield and was being suffered by Ukrainian units. And in areas where the geometry of the battlefield was very favorable to the Russian military from an artillery point of view, like Vuhledar, they were stacking artillery units one on top of each other and literally arguing over positions and generally not moving or displacing because they just weren't concerned about Ukrainian counter-battery fire at that time. They felt that they had a fairly significant advantage in that part of the front. Okay. And in general, Ukraine's been fighting this war at a quantitative artillery disadvantage with a qualitative advantage in precision fires. Now, if we fast forward to the current offensive operation, it's clear that Ukraine is able to engage in counter-battery fire with HIMARS systems, which is really the first that we're seeing it consistently. And I think that's in large part because they're able to get an ISR presence on the battlefield at depths they typically have not been able to attain before. It's very hard to get drone-based ISR that's survivable for any period of time, typically in this war beyond 15 km, which is ideally what you would want to be able to engage in effective counter-battery fire. And so we're seeing a lot more of that in the course of this offensive, using whether it's Excalibur, precision-guided artillery shells, or HIMARS systems. Russian military is probably vulnerable to it, at least in its early phase, just because I think that over the course of the winter, they've sort of developed a learned laziness due to having a significant fires advantage and not having to move much at all. And they're going to learn some very hard lessons again over the course of the summer, especially since they've generally not dealt with HIMARS-based counter battery fire before. Anyway, I'll stop there so I don't just go off on this rant.
Well, thanks for that. Michael, I know that we have several other questions from friends of ours, but we've been chatting for an hour now. I just wanted to check in. If you have any time constraints, you just let us know. Otherwise, I'm sure we're happy to put several more questions to you.
Yeah, I am staying for a bit more. I mean, I do have time constraints, but
Well, yeah, I just mean if you had,
sure.
10 minutes left, 15 minutes left, just let us know.
No, let's keep going for a bit more.
Perfect. So CJ has joined us, and I know that CJ is very interested in artillery, so I think he may have a follow-up to the conversation that we just had. Go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Just, what a lot of people have looked at throughout the course of the war and a lot of think tanks have delved into is the sort of question of when will Russia run out of ammo? And I guess almost at this point, it seems like a foolhardy task. I was just curious what your thoughts are about the state of Russian ammo production, whether it be new rounds, refurbishment, and that can really go off to a lot of different directions. But I wonder, is there anything significant you've learned about what Russia can make in terms of ammo as of, pretty currently?
Yeah. On when will they run out of ammo? I don't think that's the right way to think about it. They're going to throttle artillery ammunition used to what they have available and what they can produce and manage it. Okay, so I don't think they're going to just run out of ammo. Second, on production, so the honest answer is I don't think we have any hard numbers, but it's clear they're increasing production, and part of the way they're probably doing that is by removing a lot of checks and standards, and so they're going to take on board the risk of reliability for higher output. Third, there's probably various elements or components that to some extent they're getting from China. I suspect that's the case. And these are sort of the things that you would need, whether it's precursors, whether it's other types of materials for artillery shell production. The Russian capacity, given the size of their artillery force and the requirements, the actual production output going into this war wasn't that great. I think it was fairly anemic. That's my guess. Although everybody debates on the range of numbers. And the big question is, what can they increase it to and by how much, right? And they are likely going to have supply chain choke points, whether, it's in production of gunpowder or other things. And there's also the serviceability of barrels, right? For Ukraine, that's an issue. Typically, you've heard in the press that often, at least amongst the Western supplied barrels, Ukraine has some significant percentage out of service at any given time. What else can I add? I'm trying to remember the full length of your question on artillery production. So the way to think of it, at least from my point of view, is the Russian artillery production so low and the Western artillery production so high that in the near future, Ukraine can establish a significant quantitative advantage in artillery fires? Probably not. It's not the answer. Can both sides sustain a rate of artillery use for the foreseeable future? Let's say it's something around, I'll throw a dart at the board, 3,000 artillery shells or something like that per day. My thinking is probably yes. DPICM throws an interesting wrench into this calculus because this is probably the biggest development overall right now in terms of U.S. material assistance to Ukraine. If the U.S. changes policy on providing DPICM artillery munitions, 155s, that to me is a big deal for a couple of reasons. Much more significant than the fixation on ATACMs and these other things in the conversation. The reason why is that DPICMs unlock a very large tranche of artillery ammunition in the U.S. stockpile, right? Some percentage of the several million that the United States supposedly has, okay? This is fundamentally a numbers game. Ukraine needs more artillery ammunition. With DPICMs, the offensive operation is no longer time limited to how much artillery ammunition Ukraine has available and had been given for it, right? This means that they can proceed at their own pace. They can take an attritional approach if that's what they choose. The media won't like it. The news cycle won't appreciate it, that's for sure. But nonetheless, it may preserve the force, and it may set Ukraine up for a more successful attempt down the line, let's say later this summer. Without it, Ukraine ends up using artillery ammunition without necessarily making any significant gains or progress, and that begins to set up a real dilemma as we move into July, and it'll become a real challenge as we get into August. And I think that's probably one of the things that's motivating the U.S. administration in this decision. So my sense of it is that if there is something that the United States can introduce onto this battlefield that will make a very significant difference to Ukraine's ability to sustain the war, it is DPICMs, and it's cluster munitions. I'm not going to make any comments on cluster munitions themselves and their efficacy and all their drawbacks and all the problems with employing them, right? I'm simply speaking from the standpoint of Ukraine needs numbers of artillery shells. It needs more than it has, and there are not good ways of getting that to Ukraine based on the artillery ammunition the United States has available and the choices European countries have made, or more accurately, chose not to make for about 13 months of this war when it comes to artillery production. So,
quick follow-up from me on that. There was also discussion of the fact that the U.S. would be selecting newer produced models of DPICMs, potentially slightly different variants, in an effort to try to get the dud rate to be expected to be below 2%. And I think it was Rob Lee who tweeted out and noted that that might imply a smaller available inventory. Do you think that dud rate is going to have to slide a little bit in order to open up more inventory with time?
First, I'll just be frank, like a lot of folks, I am always skeptical of official dud rate figures. That said, I do suspect that, that could be the path the U.S. would take, which is that go for the more newer upgrade munitions, and Ukraine probably doesn't need a large part of the stockpile at this point, and some percentage would be sufficient. But honestly, I don't know the details. I'm not in the nitty-gritty. So these are kind of like inklings that you get from reporting, right? My sense of it is that however the United States chooses to approach the question of actual transfer and what part of the stockpile it selects, the change in policy unlocks millions of artillery shells, potentially, or at least, let's say, 1 million artillery shells that the United States previously did not have the ability to transfer to Ukraine. And for Ukrainian forces, that is a big deal.
Well, then that's a great development. And just a reminder to the audience that the material I had on DPICMs, I believe, is still up in the nest. It's about 3 or 4 back, it's the 5th tweet back, and it's there are about 5 sources in there in case you want to read as we're chatting. I know that Gurney had some questions about sort of overall constraints on each side. Gurney, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Michael, I have an appreciation for your large strokes, your large picture in terms of the constraints on the battlefield. I was hoping, I know some of this is sort of follow-up or cleanup from questions you've answered earlier, but if I could if I can ask you, in terms of constraints upcoming regarding Russia specifically, or if you want to volunteer for Ukraine, but of the upcoming constraints, what's on your radar in terms of things to look out for? There might be an infinite way to solve those problems, and that's for others to figure out how to do that with their creativity. But I really appreciate the eye that you have for looking at some of those constraints. And one of those particularly would be the mobilization cycle with Russia, just in terms of when they ramped up the last mobilization, a broad window between August and say November of last year. What does that broad picture look like with both personnel? I know we've been talking about artillery, but just some broad strokes about constraints. Thanks.
All right, and this is focused on Russia, right? Not Ukraine.
If you wanted to speak for Ukraine, you can as well.
Yeah, sure. No, let's focus on Russia. So, big picture constraints, from my point of view, first and foremost, it's force quality. We can regenerate quantity over time, but not quality, and so that effectively limits Russian options for force employment. And you see that their offensive potential has essentially been bled away. The combat effectiveness of the forces on the offense is fairly low, with particular exceptions of them setting up disposable forces, which is partly what Wagner was about. Wagner was up to maybe 70%, convict-based, used as an expendable force, and that's what some of these Z-Storm detachments are for as well. Second, you see that there's a real challenge for the Russian military now to scale combat operations. What the winter offensive showed, the way they prosecuted it, is that at this stage, they're not really capable of scaling up combat operations and mostly conducting combat actions with company tactical groups and the like. So you're not essentially seeing brigade-sized actions or even larger battalion tactical group-sized actions like you might have seen earlier in the war. Another constraint in the Russian military, I think at the end of the day, it's not logistics. I'll be clear on that. I think we learned a lot about Russian logistics last year that just isn't true. That's just my own opinion, and I'll leave it at that. Across the board, I heard a great deal about Russian logistical problems last year that I just don't think is correct. The aggregate data won't support that story, meaning in a lot of cases, you end up with pretty big input-output problems as an analyst where, even if you go off what Michael read to me earlier in the stock, Admiral Radican numbers, I have to figure out which of two things do I believe to be true. That Russia had major logistical problems, or that they were able to supply a fire rate that used up 10 million artillery shells over the last 15, 16 months, because I can't have both, okay? Especially since artillery and fuel uses up the bulk of the weight and volume in logistical support. So there's just an example of of how I look at things, where I often try to find input-output problems and always ask, like, how do we know what we know? And does it make sense that both of these stories are true at the same time, or do we really have to pick another one? Or do we really have to pick one of them? Okay, but back to your question. So big picture constraints, as always, I think, the munitions angle we've already covered, 6 ways from Sunday. So I think I don't want to delve too much into that conversation, but if you think overall of the Russian military as needing a combination of fire superiority and mass, okay? And if we kind of have like a very cursory depiction of the fighting up to this point, you could say that early on in the war, the Russian military had a real deficit of manpower, especially because of their losses in the first 3 weeks. And so they had a real shortage of mass, but they had a huge advantage in fires and substantial fire superiority that they used as best they could. And then their fire superiority was effectively degraded. And then they found themselves having conducted mobilization, and then they had the benefit of mass, right? But they no longer had the decisive fires advantage that they previously enjoyed. And although they had the numbers, they couldn't actually employ this force at scale on the offense, right, in offensive operations. And so they ended up, over time, with neither of the right pieces of the formula in order to be effective on the offense. At least that's my view of it today. Now, on the defense, it's a different story. And it's a lot easier to defend than it is to attack, especially when it comes to land warfare, right? Land warfare favors the defender, typically. So what else can I add on big picture constraints? Down the line, as military analysts, what I find is we are so focused on what's happening with the actual force, with material constraints, with ammunition, that we miss the kind of the big constraints are defense industrial capacity, the economy. And when you look at it from a long war perspective, those will end up being the bigger factors, right? Because I often say conventional wars between major powers, great powers, certainly any large sustained conventional war will often come down to attrition. It will have extensive attritional phases, and it's about reconstitution of manpower, material, ammunition, and most importantly, mobilization of the defense industrial base and of the economy and society. And the country that's better able to do that will be better able to reconstitute and then begin to impose very significant dilemmas on their opponent over time, at least ideally. So that's my view of it, and that's the way I tend to think about the big picture constraints and the broad categories or buckets of the things I tend to look at.
I appreciate your focus on the economics and the broad industrial base. I know several of the regulars in here focus on industrial questions. We had one from Random earlier. And my background is I'm a lawyer, but I did my studies in economics before that. So in our conversations or in the speaking material I prepare, I always include a section on economic updates, even though we don't always get to speak to it. But Gurney, I think you had one follow-up question. Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have a follow-up, and I'll split it into two just to leave them as they may. So, Michael, do you think, again, there's a lot of unknowns here, splitting what you think current Russian political objectives versus military objectives are, and do you think there's an ability for Russia to call another mobilization? Or I'll reframe that, not an ability to call for mobilization, but do you think at a certain point in time they will need to mobilize again as they did last year? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I think it really depends on how this offensive goes. So my view for a long time had been that the Russian military is going to try to do everything to avoid calling another mobilization, hence the ongoing nationwide recruitment campaign. But I am skeptical that they can manage their force in that way. But I could be wrong because they're approaching it rather differently this year than they did last year. Last year was profoundly unsuccessful. I think that they're going to make that call around fall time. And it really depends on the state of the Russian force and what they hope to accomplish after Ukraine's offensive. I am skeptical that the Russian military can generate any significant offensive potential without mobilization wave, but could end up being wrong on the score, and they actually find a way to recruit a sizable number of people, but they will have to both compensate for their losses from the winter offensive and from Ukraine's campaign this summer, and generate additional force on top of that. And I'm skeptical of how those numbers are going to add up. But you could also make a counter argument. What if the Russian leadership chooses that all they want to do is hold on to what they have, which was kind of Surovikin's overall approach, stood behind the what some folks have nicknamed the Surovikin line, right? This extensive line of defenses, minefields, entrenchments, and extend the war, and try to extend the war by at least another year or two. That's a possibility. In that case, they may find that they don't need a mobilization wave. But my own view is that they probably will. And I don't see them being able to effectively manage their force without it. Ukraine certainly hasn't been able to do that. And at the rate of attrition in this war, I think it's just going to be too challenging to do it. But they're clearly trying to do everything they can to avoid it. And I think that they're probably setting themselves up for more problems and greater force degradation because of how they've tried to piecemeal resolve this problem But there's a good reason for it, for what they're doing too, which is they're operating with a very tight, very constrained labor market. If they conduct another wave of mobilization, two things will happen. They will pull skilled labor, people they need, out of the labor market, and they will cause another panic wave of immigration, right? And they will lose more people from the economy that they cannot afford to lose, given the situation with their shortage of skilled labor as is. So, you can see now how at least both the economic factor, if not certainly the political factor, is working against the need to manage manpower in a prolonged war of attrition, and they need to generate additional forces if they want to restore any kind of offensive capacity.
Kearney, did you phrase both of your two parts there? I didn't catch that, or were you done with your question?
No, that was the question. The only overarching part of that was, do you think that the political versus military, and Michael, you sort of answered that with the Surovikin line, do you think that Russia has changed any political or military objectives, or to just discuss what those military or political objectives are?
Oh yeah, sorry if I didn't get to that. It's like 10:40 here. So on the political objectives, I think that, my own personal view, I think that they did change the objectives from the initial invasion, right? The initial invasion was meant to be a coup de main, sort of a decapitation strike, and its goal was to install a pro-Russian puppet regime in Kiev and take control of a large percentage of the country. That clearly was not possible. That initial operation failed. And to me, ever since then, the Russian objective has been to essentially try to destroy Ukraine's Ukraine's viability as a state. All right. And to hold and annex the territory that they've already formally annexed, and on top of that, capture what remains of the Donbass. But those are kind of minimalist goals. That the real Russian political objective is essentially to destroy Ukraine as a state now, since they're unable to take control of it, right? And how they do that and how they go about doing that is a different question. But to me, the overall political objective probably adjusted, after the failure of the initial invasion.
Okay, well, I think that answered the back and forth. Since we had been discussing the political implications, and you refer to the Surovikin line, a friend of ours who couldn't be here, Allsource, had a question about the political implications on the leadership of the Russian military following the coup. And for the most part, Western attention has focused on Surovikin. Do you think that there will be other impacts on leadership potential that will maybe not have an immediate effect, but a down the line effect?
Yes, that's the short answer. I'm skeptical of the expectation of purges. I don't think Putin's regime is either a mobilization regime or one that tends to purge people, but we will see. I think purge is probably the wrong term. But I suspect that right now they're investigating the extent of military involvement and active or tacit support for Prigozhin's mutiny, and we'll see what the repercussions are on the military leadership. And it could involve people like Surovikin or Alexeyev. A lot of that is yet to shake out. That said, I also want to caution folks against the rumor mill of purges, and I think Gerasimov has been purged many times now since the start of this war, to be perfectly honest, if we just go off rumors. And there are plenty of other rumors early on of FSB folks being purged and being arrested, which I'm not sure was necessarily true. So that's why I say, please be wary. I'm pretty sure Gerasimov and Shoigu have been purged a dozen times together at this point. So take take a lot of that news with a grain of salt.
So I know that it's getting fairly late for you. I'm thinking maybe we'll just put one or two more questions to you, and then we'll let you go because you've been very generous with your time. So I think I'm going to go to my co-host, Exit, who has a question about information management, information processing. Go ahead, Exit.
Thank you so much. So since the beginning of this full-scale invasion, I've been asking a lot of people, how does the plethora of information available about this war change this war and wars to come? And on the Ukrainian side, we've seen everything from real-time security camera footage tracking the first months. We were able to watch things that were happening, DJI drones giving live feeds back to command centers, mappers who aggregate all of this information and then create maps so accurate that sometimes even Ukrainian units are relying on them. Is Russia capable of capitalizing on these same changes? And does their misinformation plan get in the way of any of those?
I think the short answer is yes, they are. I think the Russian military as an organization writ large is less adaptable because command, sort of the human element, tends to centralize things, doesn't encourage or reward initiative as much, and also because the Russian system tends not to have nearly as many of civil society or commercially generated efforts that are organic to try to support the military like Ukraine does, right? So it doesn't have the sort of 1,000 blooming initiatives that are all trying to help the state or make up for shortfalls or gaps in the state. That said, you do see that there is volunteer support. There are people who are involved across the Russian society in trying to support the military. There are a substantial amount of people who support the war, at least perhaps to some extent soft support, but nonetheless. And that there is a host of activities taking place that they're not necessarily state directed, but it's just much harder in a society where the state dominates everything and tends to suppress enterprise and initiative by virtue of how the system functions. Okay, that said, can the Russian military take advantage of all these developments? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They can see, they can read, they are just as on Telegram or any other channels, and they're able to conduct open source, and they're able to conduct targeting. Maybe not as well necessarily as Ukraine, but on the other hand, keep in mind, let's just put it this way, Ukraine has a lot of help in how it finds targets and battle damage assessment and what have you, yeah? So I think I would probably over the last year and a half, I've often hear a conversation that I don't think effectively disambiguates what part of the effort is just Ukraine and what part of the effort is Ukraine with Western help and support. On the overall nature of the information, what I'll say is that, look, it's made the challenge much greater in interpreting the data, the evidence, and in keeping up with it, but also to keeping an objective perspective, understanding that you're being provided anecdotes, vignettes, and a very sort of stylized view of the battlefield, right? Both sides are presenting what are their kind of success stories, and humans, unfortunately, we tend to have a very, very poor perception of probabilities. Not probabilities. Of understanding, basically, what percentage of what is taking place are we actually seeing? Right. Every drone mission that we are presented with, the visual evidence, is successful. Is that 100% of the set, or is that 10% of the set, and 90% are not actually successful, but we never saw any of those? Right? How do we know which of those is true? How do we know how many drones were lost before the videos we were presented with could be made? Right? How long did any of these drones survive? We don't know that. Are most of the videos of the drones that drop grenades on vehicles that are moving in man? No, they're mostly on abandoned vehicles, right? Most of the strikes against vehicles that are maneuvering are done by FPV drones with RPGs mounted to them. Okay. The reason I say this is always have to keep in mind what percentage of what's actually taking place am I seeing in these videos, and how do I make sure that they don't have this immense anchoring effect on me as an analyst, right? Because they do. You do. It's very, very quick to fall into the trap of believing that whatever you're seeing is 100% of the fighting, right? By the way, this happened. We just saw it happen again at the opening of the Ukraine's offensives, where for about 4 or 5 days, Russians were showing lots of different camera angles of the exact same combat team from the 47th Brigade and their breaching equipment that was destroyed in an unsuccessful assault on Mariihev. And it had a huge anchoring effect for the conversation for at least 2 weeks, right? And it was very challenging, because all you could do is say, that's not, I mean, it is to some extent representative of the challenges that Ukrainians face, but also that's not 100% of the fighting that's taking place in the offensive. That's, you know, it's like one company. Yeah, sorry. That's my deal. For those who are interested in that conversation, I actually just put out a podcast, I think fairly recently, with Sam Bendit, who's a colleague and a coworker on Russia Contingency. I'm only bringing him up because I think he was just on your Twitter space the other day. So we had a whole conversation on drones, on how to interpret the data from drones, on what spending a year and a half of looking at drone footage is doing to us, actually, as analysts and as a community, and how it desensitizes us to the war and some of the implications of it. Anyway, it's a long discussion going down that rabbit hole.
Sam did speak with us, and in fact, he also hosted his own first Twitter space just the other day. And my co-host Exit helped him co-host that space as well. So Sam's terrific. Exit, did you have a follow-up?
I was just going to say I'll put a link to that podcast up in the nest. It was wonderful, and I listened to it, and thank you very much for that.
So I think maybe we'll just go with the last question. We'll go to Colby. I think he has a question about our blind spots. Colby, go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. This may be fairly expansive, but I'm wondering, Michael, if you think that there's any aspect or aspects of the war that are not getting the attention they should, either from the media or sort of the commentary here on Twitter, just not something we're not paying attention to, and we should be.
Let me think. So, you know, to me, usually what gets glossed over, like, this is just a personal interest. Usually what gets glossed over is the history of what happened. Now, that's, of course, a great job opportunity for folks like me and Rob Lee and others to go figure out what happened in these different offensives and operations and try to fix some of the discussion and narratives and bring as much evidence as becomes available later in the war back into the discussion. And the reason I say that is, you know, the conversation moves on week to week, right? And the question then becomes, who actually stops to go back a year and a half and ask what happened in the Battle of Kiev or what happened here and there? And journalists do that to some extent, but they're often trapped by the pace of the news and the headlines. I don't think there's enough that's discussed about electronic warfare, probably. I don't think that there's enough of a conversation on logistical adaptation and reorganization. There's a lot of bad conversations about logistics, but they're not great ones. For example, nobody asks serious questions about how Ukraine does logistics. Issues of internal distribution. How are Ukrainian forces organized? How are they supported? There's always the fixation on big ticket items and platforms, and folks like me have to annoy people in the conversation to say that actually it's a lot about the enablers, logistics, supporting equipment. And if that's not there, the defense will have big issues, because you'll get there, you find out you don't have the equipment to clear minefields, you don't have sufficient breaching equipment, what you have gets lost fairly quickly. You don't have enough support, right? You have a shortage of air defense that can advance with you, and very quickly all these things come to the fore. So, and then somebody, I think earlier asked about bridging. Yeah, and that's another good example, right? Bridging can be a very significant factor when you're trying to exploit success. What else? To me, a lot of the issues that don't really get discussed is about force reconstitution, what's happening to the force quality. Military culture doesn't come up at all. Not enough. We tried to bring that conversation up here and there, those of us that go to Ukraine, doctrine and military culture and training. And it's interesting to see how the community responds to that writing. What else? Yeah, I think to some extent, Civ Mil, the difference between political imperatives and military objectives in operation, because military strategy is fundamentally political. Its job is to link combat operations to political objectives, but there are a lot of challenges in making that happen. So I think that doesn't come up as well. That doesn't come up as often too. Yeah, I think I can make another. I can make another list, but I'm kind of operating on one cylinder at this point. The only thing I had is, Michael, if I can come back, I want to restrike an earlier target. Somebody had asked, I think it was almost an hour and a half ago, if not longer, how to get into the field, and I didn't have a great answer for them. So I thought about it while we were talking over the last 2 hours, and I think my very short answer to that would be, first, do good work. It'll speak for itself. Write, publish, have a blog, do things that add to our knowledge and understanding of the situation, right? Engage in open source analysis to the extent you can. Engage in research in whatever organization you can get into to do it. That's one. Second is work in a community. Do not work alone, all right? It's very tempting to go down a rabbit hole and work alone, but you're going to do best when you work with other people, and at the very least check in with them, right, to build on knowledge that's already there. And third, if you can, in an ideal situation, try to find mentorship, okay? It always helps. It's not always possible, but it's always useful when you can. That's about it. Last part, what not to do, and some people will not like this answer. Don't chase clout on Twitter, and don't chase popularity on Twitter. No offense, to me, Twitter it's a great resource, but it isn't real. I don't know how else to put that. Yeah, it's not to me anyway. If you want to be in the field, you need to contribute to the field. And the contributions you have to make to the field have to be off Twitter. Yeah, you cannot just be introduced as this person is popular on Twitter and he wrote some things. You have to contribute to the field. You have to engage with colleagues in it and with the community. So that's my view of how you get into it, right? And at least what the best way to do it. And if you do that, the best organizations and the best people in the field will find you. They will notice you and they will find you. They'll be interested in your work.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up our conversation, because I think it comes full circle. Given the interest of our audience in OSINT work, I know that there have been several examples of people in our community who have transitioned into more professional work. I know OSINT Technical, for example, had gone to work with the CNA, I think, a colleague of yours. And that others like Christian Tribert, who leads visual investigations at the New York Times, recently wrote about how Twitter allowed him to get exposure, but then convert that into real world opportunity and experience. So I also like that idea of community, because that's when you talk about not trying to get Twitter clout. I run fairly boring spaces that are just very focused on the detail, but the idea is to bring like a watering hole so that those who are interested in these matters can come together. So it kind of aligns with the goal I have as well, which is terrific. So Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It was a long conversation, and you've been very generous with your time. I know that others had more questions. I know there were several friends of ours who are regularly speakers, many of them military, either current or former, who couldn't be with us here tonight. And so hopefully you've enjoyed your time, and perhaps in a month or two, maybe when we see more of the results of the offensive become apparent, hopefully you'll consider coming back and speaking with us again. And I note that you also seem like occasionally you just drop in as a listener. And this is to you, Michael, and to anybody who's listening, is that I hope this space, don't get the sense that if you're listening and you come up to speak, we're going to grab you and interview you for 2 hours. I really want this to be a spot where people who have interesting things to say can come up, make a point, and then just fade back into the audience, because we just want those great points and the great listeners, and no pressure. So Michael was kind enough to offer to be a specific guest, but that's the route we're trying to take. So once again, Michael, thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation, and it's great connecting with all of you. And I can't see the kind of extensive list of all the folks on this Twitter space, but I do read and appreciate and benefit from a lot of your work out there.
And so I guess just as a final note, guys, remember that, keep an eye out for Michael's profile. I would suggest that you give him a follow. And he also hosts the Russia Contingency podcast on War on the Rocks. So if you want to check that out, go over to the War on the Rocks website, and he produces great content there. And I appreciated in Michael's advice there. He talked about, write a blog, get involved. Because in reading a bit on Michael's background, I read up that he maintained, sort of a personal blog of his own for many years. So I think that he, in some ways, came up in the same way that many of us are. So I think with that, I'm going to move on to our regular updates. A lot of the updates with regard to the offensive are things that we just spoke about in conversation with Michael, but I'll run through them quickly anyway. So first, I'll put up the set of maps, and this is a reminder that we really enjoy the efforts that the mappers among us go to track events on the ground in close detail. We don't go into discussing the minute changes on the maps. Instead, what I counsel is to survey some of the best that are out there. So in that first tweet in the nest, you'll see I've included maps from the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, Deep State, and then also a map from Andrew Perpetua. And I would encourage you to check those out, again, because they take slightly different approaches, and they have different information sources. I think it's a good idea to keep an eye on several of them. I know Andrew Perpetua is a friend of the space. He hosts a YouTube talk twice a week about his maps. I believe it's Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and then I believe it's Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So in the afternoon for those friends who are in Europe. So check those out. In that tweet, I've also included, because I'd like to do it as an overview along with the maps, tweet from David Helms, who is a friend of ours who tracks weather and water in Ukraine closely. So that's a link to his daily weather update for the next few days, where it's due in the south to be very hot and very dry. And then I also included just a graphic to look at the overall situation. It's a GIF from Ilya Ponomarenko of the Kiev Independent, showing how the front line has changed in the Donetsk region in the last year. The second item in the nest is some material on developments in the offensive. And so I'll break some of these out into the nest individually, but I'll just run through them quickly. So the first item is that the most significant change on the front in the last few days has been around the village of Klishivka, which is on the southern edge of Bakhmut, and that there were reports that the Ukrainians had seized the heights around the village, and there were mixed reports about control of the village itself, but I think that the best understanding of it is that Russia still has, it's like a gray zone, but Russia still has control of the village. But Ukrainian forces are working to change that. The second item in the nest, I made reference to it in questions to Michael earlier, but those were reports from Project Owl, who creates the Ukraine control map, saying that the Ukrainian Defense Center Daily Brief reported on several brigades being moved from Kherson to Bakhmut. So that's what specifically what I was referring to with the suggestion that Russia is reinforcing Bakhmut, potentially at the expense of Kherson. And as we discussed, that's likely because of the political value Russia places on Bakhmut, and that Ukraine's likely taking advantage of that for an attritional advantage in the region. The third item back in the nest is just to talk about the overview of how the offensive is going. I know we had a lengthy discussion about it, but there was an interesting detail whereby some military analysts who are members of the Armed Forces of Austria, I believe they're popular on YouTube, had come out and said they believed that the first phase of the Ukrainian offensive had failed. But this leads into the points raised with Michael about whether this is just an initial attrition phase, and that without air support or air supremacy, it's very difficult to accomplish the tasks that Ukraine is attempting early on. So I wanted to raise that narrative as being one out there, and to highlight some pushback against it. So you'll see that pushback in the tweet from our friend Patrick Fox. The fourth item back in the nest is that thread from Thomas Tyner that I referred to, where he makes a lengthy argument that this is really just the first phase, and that really it's proceeding as you should expect, and that the arguments that it's a failure are invalid because of that. So I'll leave that to you to evaluate his argument, though. The fifth item back in the nest is a tweet from WarMapper. So we've included his general map, but this is also to give context for the progress of the offensive. What he's done is graph as a time series changes in terrain. And so you can see of course, the significant, there was a seizure of terrain in the initial Russian invasion, then gradual Russian gains through to the sudden Kherson and Kharkiv offensives, where Ukraine, with the yellow bars, took back lots of territory. And then you can see the most recent Ukrainian territorial gains in the early part of the offensive scaled. So it's interesting to compare progress across time. While I set up the next block of material, Wolverine, did you want to come in with a point?
Yeah, there's a couple actually. Kind of some which are brought up by Michael. Since I know Michael's, I see him still up here. The only thing I wanted to bring up while he was still here was that they said about mobilization, and most of the stuff I see, I don't see a whole lot, but I see it from different aspects, what's online, what's in the news, also different sources. But with the new laws that have been passed by the Duma, which Vladimir Putin, I believe, has already signed into effect, there are actually a lot of jobs, professions, and stuff like that, that even if they do a mobilization, that the Russians will not pull people from. One of them is actually factory workers, especially if they're in the DIB, because right now that's the one thing that's kind of killing them in a way, and keeping their forces from having the equipment they need. Because if they start pulling from the factories, well, they lose the people who are manufacturing the munitions, the weapons, the tanks, and all that stuff. So that was one thing that I did see it was posted on ISW, and I saw a couple of other places, is that the Russians don't want to do a full mobilization either, because one, there are all these people who would not go, and two, that with the amount of the mobilizations that they've done and the amount of troops that they've lost, with the very minimal, minimal gains that they've gotten, that the Russian people, we may not see it because of the censorship coming out of Russia, what it may be, but a lot of the people, I think, are actually dissatisfied with how the war is going. I mean, when you sit there and say, the city of Bakhmut, it's like, oh, well, it took, Wagner 9 to 10 months to get Bakhmut. But you look at the areas north and south of how much the Ukrainians have got, they've gotten, a decent amount of terrain back in as little, a tenth of the time that the Wagner forces, which are the best troops, did get while out there. The other thing is that, this is a huge, initially they had moved the 20th, I think it was motorized rifle division. I forgot what division it is, but it was a 20th out to Bakhmut. Now, the reason that's huge is because those dudes were literally the only division reserve that all of the units in Zaporizhia and Kherson had. They had nothing else for reserves. So that means is that if the Ukrainians do have a breakthrough in Russian lines, they have no reserves to fill it or to try and block that breakthrough in the lines. They literally would have to pull units from another part of the line in order to do that. And the problem is if they do that, they're going to be at the disadvantage because they're going to be having doing a, fighting while on the move, because once the Ukrainians get through those lines, that's it. There's open territory in some areas, and the Russians are going to have to try and deal with that, which we've seen from a lot of the different offensives and operations that the Ukrainians carried out, that they're not doing very well at them. They're doing decent in the defensive, but not in offensive operations. Well, based on top of that, though, I found out that they've actually moved the 150th Division. I don't remember what designator, it's a motorized or infantry. And they moved another unit out to the Avdiivka, Bakhmut area, along with it, which they did this before when the 20th MRD got moved, was they actually pulled units from Crimea down to the Bakhmut area. So it looks like no matter what everybody says, and this is just me from the ground pounder side, is, the guy who's out there who had to be dealing with this stuff, is that they're focusing on their main mission objective, which was to free the areas of the Luhansk and the Donetsk Oblast. And that's it. Because right now they've seen what's going on. I mean, they have literally 5 brigades that are actually doing operations in the Zaporizhia, Kherson area, and they're annihilating these divisions. Even they're probably half strength. The 49 CAA, I think I talked with someone, they literally have like a division and a half of dudes, and that's it. 35th, they're not that much better off. So
Wolverine, I take your point, and it's interesting because the next little bit of material I was going to put up, if you have a look at the first item in the nest, it's a tweet from P-Style 1 where he's talking about the movement of Russian reserves. And the only reason I interrupt Wolverine is that it can be very difficult to track these things when they're just spoken, which is why if we're looking at individual movements along the front, I'd encourage you to go and check out Andrew Perpetua's streams, because he live streams his screen. And so he moves around and can indicate where things are changing, which is it's just a different format than is possible with Twitter Spaces at the moment. However, that tweet in the nest contains reference to a number of military units, I think some of which Wolverine was just speaking to. I'll admit I haven't gone through the list of units identified there to try to confirm them myself. So it's a little bit buyer beware. But it was this tweet that inspired me to ask Michael about the movement of and availability of Russian reserves. So Wolverine, I think we're right on the same page, and it'll be an interesting item to keep an eye on. Random, did you want to come in with a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to bounce in real quick on that because I think a lot of talk about a couple points is with reserves is, if you notice, it's not just about questions that have arisen from, well, where are the reserves located? What are they using reserves? In other cases, it's with the Prigozhin issue with the armed mutiny and everything. You have to wonder if Zolotov is going to demand more resources for the Rosguardia, considering how they played a role in how the PR turned out. But that's just a personal thought. I could get into the Kremina versus Klishivka axes in the Bakhmut area, but really I just wanted to make a shameless plug for War on the Rocks, because the June 29th episode with Ryan, Michael's co-host, is with General Hecker and Air Marshal, let me see if I have the right name, Stringer, and they talk about the space and the air axis of the counteroffensive and the war so far. And I think that's a big thing that's going on right now, is we're probably in the first war in quite a while where no one has defined air superiority, and that's made a huge difference to the counteroffensive, and we're still trying to play that out. Anyway, I encourage people to go listen to that. But the other thing is you see that with what we're talking about with OSINT, with privatized space use and the use of all these technologies, and at the same time you have air assets and air defenses. So the war's being primarily fought with air defense systems, and we were talking about storm shadows earlier, and you can see the buildup of attack helicopters in Berdyansk. Brady Afric has great satellite photos, images of that, how they built that up to use the Ka-52s and the Mi-28 Havocs that have been harassing the Ukrainian counteroffensive quite a bit. So people who thought attack helicopters were done, not so much. But the thing is, you see the buildup of air defense assets, and you see the buildup of combat aviation that is being used to some effect, in some degree, and you have to wonder if those reserves are going to play a role, because Russians can still churn out aircraft. They just don't have the personnel probably to man those aircraft. So I think that's some other point we have to get into. So you have to wonder how many more Ka-52s can get lost over Zaporizhia or over Donetsk before there's a major difference. Heck, one got shot down over freaking Voronezh.
Thanks for that, Random. Yeah, if you happen to have a link to that latest episode of War on the Rocks that you referred to, if you could add it to the nest for the audience, that would be great. And I've been told by a listener about an important item, which is that we're talking about moving reserves, and that moving a regiment from a division is not the same thing as moving a whole division, which is absolutely true. Which is why when I put that tweet up from the first item in the nest from P-Style 1, where he refers to units, I say, buyer beware. And I would encourage you to go to look at some of the better formed maps, like the Project OWL map that includes unit references, as they will break down in as much detail as they can when portions of a unit are being moved, as opposed to the whole unit. But of course, there are limits to how much insight OSINT can generate. So, what I put up is the feedstock to analysis, not necessarily completed analysis. And so that I hope that listeners keep that always in their mind. We do the best we can to check things, but that you should always check for yourself. Sorry, just a moment, just reading in the background. Right. So one further point was sent to me, which is that the reserve issue is not an across the front issue, but may be more localized. Right. Okay. So essentially, that's just I just received some cautions from an astute listener who said check in as much detail as you can with regard to the question of reserves, including on sort of a region by region level, which is a fair point. And I see that Random has added in his link to the War on the Rocks episode on air and space power, so that's great. So jumping back into running through some of the updates in connection with the offensive, I'm now on the third item in the nest, which just goes to overall balance of equipment. We referred to this in our discussion with Michael. This linked in Jimmy Rushton's tweet is the story from Bloomberg, which makes the assertion that Ukraine now has more tanks operable or in service than Russia does at this point. And as we discussed, it's extremely difficult to get precise numbers on that. And we heard Michael's caveats about how he believes some of the original numbers of Russian tanks were overstated, and the challenges in estimating in service using OSINT means. But just because that Bloomberg article is going around and getting lots of attention online, I thought I would raise it. The fourth item back in the nest is the link to the Financial Times article that we discussed with the quote from Admiral Radakin in the United Kingdom, who in that interview stated he believes Russia has lost half of Ukraine, that Russia has lost half of its combat capability in Ukraine. So if you hadn't seen that, there's the source. The fifth item back was an interesting one to my eye. The Ukrainians will often make claims about ratios of casualties. And this fifth item from the Kiev Independent included a conversation with General Syrskyi, who's the Ukrainian Ground Forces commander. And specifically, he said he believes that Russia is now suffering 8 to 10 times as many losses as Ukraine across the battlefield. Now, that there have been lots of claims along these lines in various battles. Those numbers seem pretty high to my eye, but I wanted to put them out there because I'm always interested when a senior source puts out specific numbers. And final note in this block, the sixth item back in the nest caught some people's attention. It was a photo of an American Patriot system, and it has kill marks on the side. And so among the marks are icons for drones, cruise missiles. But what really caught people's attention was the fact that it appeared to include 3 marks for combat helicopters and then 3 marks for fast jets. And there were claims that there was that one incident where I believe it was 4 helicopters, and I thought
it was Berdyansk. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was June, or it was either May 13th or June 13th in Berdyansk, and it was when the Su-34, the Su-35, and the 3 Mi-8 EW variant helicopters were shot down mysteriously over Berdyansk, and they didn't know what caused it.
Thanks for that. I couldn't remember whether it was 3 helicopters or 4, but so that would imply these kill marks that this portion of the Patriot battery may have been involved in that, which led to some interesting questions among the folks who are really interested in missile technology about how close to the front a Patriot would have to get its radar systems in order to be effective, given that I understand the models of Patriot munitions that are available at the moment need to be guided by radar onto target. And so it led to quite an interesting conversation. So perhaps maybe I'll just ask one of my co-hosts if they could just do a quick admin update while I get the next block of materials up in the nest.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So once again, thank you for coming, everyone. The nest is the little space up above our heads. If you scroll right to the top, you'll find all of the resources that Michael and others have put up there. If you go down to the bottom right hand of your screen, you'll see a purple button. And if you click on that, it'll take you to the tweet for the space, and you can go into there and retweet it out if you want your followers to come and join us. Or if you are looking for it later, you might want to bookmark it so that you can come back and listen to the space again later. I know I often will listen to the space more than once because there's always something that I missed the first time around. And then you'll also find everything in the nest gets added and shared to the bottom of that tweet. And so if you're looking for any of the resources in the next week or so, you'll be able to go to that tweet and be able to follow along with each of the resources. If you want to come up and join us and speak and ask some questions or bring some details, resources, in the bottom left hand of your screen, you'll see a request the mic button. Just click that and we'll have a look and probably bring you up.
Thanks very much. So this is a shorter block of material. These are just sort of miscellaneous items, but in connection with the offensive. And so the first of these we already discussed with Michael a little bit, which is the theory about destruction of Russian ammo dumps, or as Michael pointed out, just sort of transfer facilities that may not be dedicated ammunition dumps or depots. And so the theory presented here is that those depots may be being moved up because of pressure on Russian logistics. The details that Michael added in the discussion were that he thought that Ukraine probably wasn't munitions limited, but that in fact it's just hard to find these locations, particularly to find them in a way that they can be acted upon in a timely way, because of the delay between locating a position and the ability to strike it. But anyway, I thought it was an interesting theory on the recent spate of strikes against concentrations of ammunition. The second item back is a link to an article that was published in the Times in Britain, that it's a profile inside a partisan group that's fighting the Ukrainian counteroffensive behind enemy lines. And this interview got a lot of attention, and it was connected to that idea of strikes against concentrations of ammunition. So wanted to make sure that was on your radar. The last item in this block, the third item back, is a tweet by Dan Cazzetta. And this relates to some claims that came up in the last few days, specifically that a chemical weapon may have been used. And the claims were specific to a material called lewisite. Now, I bring Dan's up because Dan is an expert in chemical weapons, and he is, fairly active here on Twitter in terms of trying to provide information and debunk these items. And he notes that the footage that was going around in association with the claim weren't consistent with the characteristics of lewisite, including the fact that lewisite would normally be a liquid, but that even in vapor form, it would be much denser than air. And so this idea, the footage that showed, a smoke column rising up, wouldn't be consistent with the use of those chemical weapons specifically. I bring Dan up because I think that there have, in the last few days, been more than one claim of use of chemical weapons. And I think Dan would be one of just a handful of go-to people here on Twitter in order to get more information on those claims. So I would suggest that you particularly if you see the claims going around, before retweeting them or amplifying them, have a look to see whether Dan or an expert like him has weighed in on the question. I'm going to put up the next block of material, which relates to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. In the last couple of days, there was quite a lot of concern that there would be a sabotage attempt at the plant. President Zelensky even came out to speak about it, and I'm sure that we all saw tweets about Ukraine practicing decontamination drills, and there was material shared about how in Enerhodar, which is the town nearest the plant, that they would, if there were a nuclear event, instead of just general sirens, they would play church bells, and if it was an evacuation,
Michael, you just cut out. Are you aware?
I think you muted yourself there, Mr. Bond.
It appears we may have lost Mr. Bond for just a moment.
Oh no.
I thought I got booted.
Yeah, I thought my sound had cut as well. Random, you were going to say something there?
No, I mean, we'll wait to see if Mr. Bond responds, but I know where he's picking up. Just as a side note, since we were on the topic of chemical weapons, the United States has just disposed or is about to dispose of its last chemical weapon at the disposal site in, I believe it's Virginia. I might be wrong. I got to reread the post, but it was in the New York Times today. Basically, the last canister of sarin gas, which would mean the end of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile, which is kind of cool because chemical weapons are needlessly.
And you actually believe that?
It's. I mean, they're just a mess to take care of. Like as opposed to like nukes or other stockpiles of weapons. I mean, chemical weapons are just a massive handful to take care of and keep in track and everything. It's. I'm kind of glad we're getting rid of them.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, apologies for that. Just a reminder to those who have joined us that I host these spaces from an emulator in order to have a more stable hosting connection, but unfortunately that sometimes generates errors in the microphone that I then need to reset. So I'm back. I'm just putting the last of the material on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant up in the nest. Okay, so there was concern. I'm not sure exactly where my audio cut out there, but there was concern about a potential attack that was speculated to be set for July the 5th. But of course, that didn't come to pass. In the last few days, there was some focus on satellite imagery of the roof of the plants themselves. And so if you have a look at the first tweet in the nest from Jeff Broomfield, his is sort of the last word in a series of exchanges on the topic. And so there was some imagery put out, and you'll see it in the GIF that's embedded in that tweet, that showed the roof of reactor 4 at the plant. And people had highlighted some points that appeared to suddenly appear on the roof. And that led to concern that, what are those objects? Could those objects be in association with a, sabotage attempt or the storage of weapons on the roof? But at this point, there's no particular evidence what they are or that there's necessarily reason for concern. Jeff in his thread goes through the fact that there were 2 satellite passes that day and that the first pass didn't detect those objects and that they only showed up in the second. His theory is that they may just be structural elements that are on the roof, and it just so happened to be captured during a satellite pass when the angle of the sunlight was just perfect on those elements that they would be, picked up reflecting the sun. But ultimately, his position is that we will just have to wait until the satellite pass is available tomorrow. And I know that friends of ours, Radio and Nukes, is a friend of ours who gets satellite imagery for analysis as well, and I see him throwing a thumbs up. So have either keep an eye on Jeff Broomfield's account or have a look at Radio and Nukes account, as the latest imagery when it comes out in the next day or so will probably be put up by one of them. The second item back in the nest is from Ewan McDonald. And he notes it was published that apparently Russia is intending to put reactor 4 into hot shutdown mode. Now, what I had heard about this is that all of the reactors were in shutdown, but that I believe reactor 5 had previously been running in hot shutdown. And we had a conversation with Mark Nelson, who goes on Twitter by Energy Bants, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks ago, where he explained the condition to us, and that at that time, that hot shutdown, which was generating a little bit of power for sort of internal purposes of the plant, it had actually been fully shut down. So my understanding was that all the reactors were down for a few weeks. But now Ewan, in his tweet, is saying Russian media is reporting they're going to be putting reactor 4 back into hot shutdown. I don't think this raises the risk considerably. My understanding is that hot shutdown means that it's heating up some of the water, but that it's not generating steam. Hopefully that description is correct enough. But it's just interesting to see that they're, going back and forth between complete shutdown and having one reactor in this hot shutdown state and further that it appears they may have switched from reactor 5 to reactor 4. So I put that there as an item to keep your eye on. The third item back is a link to the statement of the International Atomic Energy Agency. You probably all saw the headline that said that IAEA had not detected any explosives around the plants in their inspection. However, they were not permitted access to all of the facilities and that they were seeking that additional access. I don't think they've since come out to say they have received access to all the available facilities, but if you wanted their full statement, beyond just the headlines, the link to it is there. The fourth item back in the nest is just a refutation of some Russian claims, where Russia had asserted that Ukraine would attack the plants. And in particular, they had suggested that Ukraine might use a radiological bomb. Now, there's, of course, nothing to support that. This tweet, fourth back in the nest by Pavel Podvig, goes into the silliness of it because the Russian claim had been fairly specific about removing nuclear material from another plant and using that, which, Pavel's explanation is that that would be extremely dangerous and just it's not feasible as described. Last point, then I'll go to Hans. For those who are interested in sort of tracking the up-to-the-minute data, the fifth tweet back in the nest from Lauren Wolf includes a link to a website or domain, saveecobot.com, and it has fairly recent radiation data on the map. And so that was one link I saw shared by several people in case you were trying to monitor it in close to real time. Random, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch off on the stuff that Interfax reported out, and then Pavlov's takedown of Povic's takedown of it, because he makes a very salient point, which is the main excuse that the Russians were reporting is that the Ukrainians were going to arm a Toshka U SBM with a explosive filled with nuclear waste. And Pavel, in the tweet below, the one you linked, shows an illustration of how the size of a nuclear waste container is. It is the size of a full train car. So it's like you want to load that onto a missile half the size. So it just plays into some of the ridiculousness that is the stories or excuses that the Russian side has put out of potential attacks by Ukrainians with all sorts of magic weapons, like, a T-14 Armada or something.
Yeah, Pavel, or his handle, what is it, Russian Forces?
Yeah, at Russian Forces.
Is a great account to follow on Russian nuclear matters. Okay, next subject I wanted to chat about was the ongoing fallout from the Wagner Revolt. We spent a lot of time on this a little over a week ago. These are two blocks of fairly quick updates with the latest developments. The first of which is that apparently today Lukashenko, the leader in Belarus, stated in a press conference that Prigozhin was not in Belarus at the time. And I believe he said he may be in St. Petersburg, he may be in Moscow. And if I didn't include it in my materials because it came up at the last moment, but people tracking Prigozhin's plane actually did see it travel from Belarus, I believe, to Moscow and then back to St. Petersburg. So we have some confirmation of Lukashenko's statements. Random, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in on this for two reasons. One is that Prigozhin pretty much stated what has been tracked by some outlets in St. Petersburg. I don't remember if it was Fortash or the initial news agency that was following the raids of Prigozhin's estates when the police raided them. But they were tracking, it said that Prigozhin was in St. Petersburg by his yacht, I believe, a few days ago. But nobody could confirm that. And they're still going off the Belarus thing. Excuse me. So that's part of it. The other part is I see you're linking materials and stuff in the nest. Can I please, pretty please, link the photos of his disguises?
So if you have a look at the second item in the nest. Oh, his disguises. Sure. Yeah, if you like. That's more meme based, but
I know, but I feel like we've dealt with Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group in so many of our spaces. We just kind of need something for catharsis.
Sure.
So.
And just as a note, I know that I switched into update mode. Two things I'll ask of my co-hosts. One is if we start clearing out the nest, just because I'm going to keep feeding it, that would be great. And number two is I don't know I can break away, but the flight tracking info on Prigozhin's plane was put up by Jack Margolin. So maybe if somebody could grab that and put it in the nest just to back up my statement, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So the second item back in the nest is the tweet from Julia Davis. Many people covered it. Hers had the most comprehensive set of pictures. Were the tweets, were the pictures from the raid on Prigozhin's house. And they revealed a whole bunch of things that appear to be somewhat embarrassing to Prigozhin. They revealed the medals he had received, weapons, money, disguises, fake passports, those sorts of things. I think Random's now put up some of the photos, the selfies that apparently Prigozhin had taken in his various disguises that have people laughing online a bit. But I also saw somebody make the thoughtful point that all of these photos are coming from Russian Kremlin sources. And so you have to take them with a grain of salt, even though they're not as against the Ukrainians. The people who took them may have an incentive to make Prigozhin look bad. And so you can't assume that everything that was there were actually Prigozhin's possessions, particularly as there are still reports that there may be ongoing investigations against Prigozhin. Kitty, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, that's so true. And that Russian television show that has the preposterous woman and all the 5 or 6, I just can't remember the name of it right now, but they're all
60 minutes. 60 Minutes on Roshi at Run with Oleg. I think we know you're talking about the lady, the lady with the ponytail that they call the Iron Doll of the Kremlin.
Yeah, no, it's not that one. But sorry. Anyway, they went through each item of his, and they just ragged on it and made fun of it and ridiculed him, and so it really looked like a setup for him. And then when they got to the passports, they were like, now why would anybody possibly need 20 passports? And they went through it. Well, I mean, obviously he would need quite a few passports, right? So I don't know, the whole thing was really preposterous and fun.
Well, with regard to the passports, Bellingcat actually previously published some investigations several years ago. I can't recall, I think it may have been 2020 or just before that. Apparently Prigozhin, as a publicity stunt, wanted to demonstrate the weakness of the EU's immigration system or EU visa system. And so I think it may have been a project he went through to make several fake identities in order to pass into the EU. So I don't know that it's actually specifically for his use, to do clandestine things, because clearly some of the costumes are preposterous, but that they may have been meant to be slightly silly in order to make fun of EU customs procedures. But anyway, if you look on Bellingcat, they've tweeted about it in the last little while. Jumping back. Okay, go ahead, Random. And then
one final point on this. Historically speaking, this is not the first time a Russian figure has used disguises in either their work or for whatever reason. Famously, Vladimir Lenin, if you guys are familiar with my Russian Civil War spaces, had Stalin shave his beard and mustache off so he could dress up as a Finnish peasant with a wig and get back across during the July Day crackdown. So it's not the first time that a Russian has disguised himself with a wig. That being said, it's clear that the Kremlin has decided to crack down on Prigozhin by hitting his image and his finances more than what's going on with the mutiny and all that. But I will recommend that while there are a lot of funny and silly things about this, it's also a reminder that some of the stuff in the house that we've seen is keen is that mob boss gangster mentality that is with a lot of people around Putin, which is one of the more not safe for work things. Was there was a very graphic portrait or picture he had hanging in his office, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, not to leave people in suspense. It's not so graphic to say. It was apparently heads in that photo.
Yeah, it was a bunch of severed heads.
Right.
Michael, I
Go
think
ahead.
your mic might be going a little wonky
Sure.
again. I'll just say I did find that show and I put it in the Nest, and there's English translations on it, and it's really worth watching. It's pretty hilarious. And those wigs, though, they're not believable to anybody, like green and pink and stuff. They're not like clandestine, like really trying to be an alter character at all. They're just, those are just some, I don't know what. But
I would just like to thank Caliber Obscura when he took the Elton John post by Ollie Alexander and wrote the lines, "Hold me closer, tiny pantsier."
I'm sure that somebody would get a ton of attention if they took all the Prigozhin memes and put them in one thread, because there were a lot of good ones. Sorry, Wolverine, did you want to come in?
I don't have any of those at all.
Okay, we'll have a look around. There's everything from Prigozhin in disguise as Guess Who characters, the old kids game, or CAPTCHA challenges, security challenges, where you have to identify like all of the bicycles or the buses. There was one, identify all the Prigozhins in disguise. So, but anyway, I'm going to get back to updates.
I'll DM you some, Wolverine.
Thanks.
So the sixth item back in the Nest, it's weird, given that if Prigozhin is permitted to return to Russia, which isn't surprising. When we spoke about this on the weekend, we highlighted that photo of him in a helicopter, and we tracked his flights at that time. And I suggested that it made sense that he was permitted to assist in the windup of Wagner, because it would be much harder for the Kremlin to seize assets and sort of rearrange operations with no assistance from Prigozhin. So they would have some incentive to permit that. But given that they're releasing these embarrassing raid photos, at the same time, this tweet from the Moscow Times, where the police have now reported they returned a considerable amount of money to Prigozhin that was seized, both from I believe his offices and his home. And I think the amount was some huge amount, like 100 million rubles, I think was the amount, if I'm not mistaken, which, is several $1 million. So it's interesting that there may be an investigation of him ongoing. He's exiled to Belarus, but he's allowed to remain in Russia to wind things up, and they're giving him back, large amounts of seized cash. So it's a very confusing situation. The seventh tweet back in the Nest is from Zoya Sheftalovich, who is a senior, I believe she's an editor at Politico. And she notes that on Russian 60 Minutes, they are still reporting that the criminal case against Prigozhin is ongoing. So again, that's just adding to the confusion. The eighth item back, I know we're getting deep in the Nest now. The eighth item back is a tweet by Dmitry Alperovich, which it's speculation, but it's an interesting thought. And he's making the argument that perhaps some of the negotiation that is going on is not merely winding down Prigozhin's affairs in Russia, but that he may be essentially lobbying at the same time in an effort to either spin his actions in connection with the revolt, or potentially to try to lobby to say, look, I was doing this for good ends. Maybe you should change your mind and not exile me. Perhaps I can continue to have a role, essentially seeking a form of forgiveness. And I thought that was an interesting suggestion. I believe the last item here in this block in connection with Wagner, it's way back. It's the ninth item back, tweet by Chris O. And this is a translation he did of Russian media reporting on the continued absence of General Surovkin, where, there had been reports that he had been taken into custody so that his connections with Wagner could be investigated. Now, this media outlet is reporting that he has missed several family events, specifically the birthday of his wife. So if he's missing these important things, the implication is that he is definitely not at liberty, although we still don't know how seriously, whether it is investigation or custody likely to lead to charges against him. Okay, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to put the next block of material up in the nest. We have a few more points on Wagner, then we'll move on to Ukrainian equipment. So the first of these that will appear there in just a moment were some photographs that came out that were on the ground apparently from the new camp that's being constructed in Belarus for Wagner forces. There had previously been satellite photos released of the layout of that camp, and these on-the-ground photos are sort of consistent with the likely layout of that camp. So it's just an interesting insight into what their facilities are like, and the fact that these can be leaked out, is interesting all on its own. So that first tweet is from the Belarusian Hagen Project, which is doing terrific work on the ground in Belarus. The second tweet back in the nest is referring to a statement by Vedomosti, which is Russian media, suggesting that former members of Wagner could still have the option to join the Rosgvardia, which is sort of like the National Guard. Presumably that's meaning if they were not permitted to join the Russian regular forces. And maybe more interestingly, Vedomosti is saying that apparently operations in Africa will not cease. Wagner operations in Africa will not cease, and that's according to various sources. However, there are some definite changes that are taking place. So the third item back in the nest notes kind of mixed results with regard to Wagner. The first of which is the transfer of control of the Internet Research Agency. We spoke about this on Sunday. It's one of the primary online influence operations that Prigozhin operated. And at that time, the latest information was that a media group controlled by Putin's mistress, or that Putin's mistress is the chairman of the media group, that was bidding to control this Internet Research Agency. So it seemed like the Kremlin was taking control of those networks. But at the same time, while there are reports that contracts with Wagner's Concord catering service were being canceled for the regular Russian military, there are reports that apparently the contracts are being maintained for some bases of Russian forces abroad in Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. So again, sort of mixed results in terms of Wagner being shut out of the Russian system. The fourth item back in the nest relates to Wagner operations in Africa, and this makes a point that often comes up in our spaces, which is essentially that if you're going to make a claim, you need to know what normal looks like. And so there were reports going around that Wagner forces may have been withdrawing from the Central African Republic. However, John Lechner, in his tweet here, notes that it's coming up to the rainy season in Central African Republic, and that it's not unusual that essentially Wagner can't conduct the same sort of commercial operations as it during the dry season. And so it's not unusual for them to withdraw some forces at this time. So that's, it's great to have people to follow who understand this sort of context. Final note on Wagner. There are lots of good accounts that follow them. There's, All Eyes on Wagner, Casus Belli, and some others do great work tracking them. This account, it's the fifth item back in the nest, called Stop Wagner Group, is a new account for me, but their material was retweeted by some good OSINT accounts. And they have a 2 or 3 part series where they map out the business connections that Russia has in Africa. And so it's important to recognize that it's not, just militarily, but that there's lots of, businesses and cutouts and media that Wagner has control over in Africa. Okay, I'm going to move on to putting up some material about the D-Pickums, which was a topic that came up in conversation with Mr. Kofman. I put the block of material up before, but I'll just put up the individual tweets so that I can run through them quickly. As a reminder, we run these conversations for about 3 hours, and so we're, just coming up on 3 hours now. I think what I'm going to do is run maybe an extra 20 minutes or so, 20 minutes to half an hour, just to get through some of the updates on equipment, because I know people are particularly interested in those. And just a reminder for those who are new to the space that all of these sources are in a thread. Here, I'll actually put the whole thread up in the nest so that you can click through to it. But all the sources are in a single thread, so you can always, in my spaces, have a look at that, so you can look ahead at what we're going to discuss, and you have all the reading and reference material to take away with you. So the first item in the nest, which should populate in just a moment, is a link to that background agenda, so you can click through to the thread. Yeah, okay. So on the DPICM front, D-Pickums, one of the latest updates, and this was Colby's tweet, but he's passing along the message from Politico, was that it's reported that the decision to send cluster munitions has actually now passed to President Biden's desk. So it's that close. The earlier rumors had just been that it was, under consideration and making progress, but now apparently it is just waiting on Biden's signature.
On the topic of that, I see Colby has his hand up, Mr. Bond, but I did want to ask, because there's another rumor that if they send 100,000 of these cluster munitions, that Colby will eat his hat.
We'll leave that to Colby to confirm. Go ahead.
So a few things. It's a little bit further along now. We've got reporting that there's actually going to be a presidential drawdown authority package tomorrow in which the DPI CMs are supposed to be provided. There is a claim that I think this is from Politico as well, actually, that 100,000 of them will be sent. Whether that's true or not, I guess depends on how you're actually counting, because I don't think he actually explicitly said in his own tweet. So I would argue that it is most definitely not going to be 100,000 shells. That's kind of mathematically impossible, and I've spent quite a lot of time this evening arguing with people about this, and you can go look at all the tweets I've written about it on my page. So I wouldn't expect that many. We'll see ultimately tomorrow, but it is a $800 million package now, which is going to include more Bradleys and more Strikers as well, and probably some miscellaneous other things, in addition to the cluster munitions, which I suspect will be the newest 155 millimeter M864 DPI CM cluster munitions that are going to be provided, probably several thousand, I would imagine.
Well, thanks for those updates. Just a reminder to those who are new here that Colby pays close attention to the contracting side. He's one of 2 or 3 friends of ours who cover sort of the U.S. drawdown congressional angles. So keep an eye on his account for updates there. Wolverine, would you like to go ahead?
So with all the equipment getting over to Ukraine and stuff like that, and then a lot of different people in Twitter, different spaces, they always talk about air defense and stuff like that. The one thing I'm actually wondering is there is a piece of equipment that I don't know if the U.S. has that many more, but there's a lot throughout different countries. Is the M136s and the M176, I believe is correct. vehicles and trailers that are, there's a lot built and there's a lot throughout the world, but there's just not a lot in the U.S. anymore. And what they are is they're a SHORAD, but they're mounted with a radar-controlled 20-millimeter Vulcan gun. Basically, the same gun, the M61, that is like mounted on the F-15s and the aircraft like that. So I'm wondering if there's even any of those in storage anymore anywhere, or the U.S. can actually try and get some of them, because a system like that is highly mobile. It's actually got a really good gun on it. The ammunition actually will detonate at a specific range also, the newer ammunition. And it's the exact same ammunition that the CRAM itself would use. So I'm wondering if that's something that they should, if Ukraine could try and see request if there are any of those systems available.
Colby, did you want to come in on that?
Are you talking about the Vulcan air defense?
Yeah, the trailer and the M113 variant.
Right. Yeah. I mentioned this specific system when I wrote a thread about SHORAD last year. Going from memory, this would have been some time ago. There may have been one journalist who asked the Pentagon about the prospects of sending VADs to Ukraine. There was not a committal answer of any sort really on that. As far as I know, there's definitely some of these still sitting around in storage in the United States. So it's something that is definitely possible. The problem with VADs, even though the advantage of VADs is that it has very ubiquitous ammunition. It's got the 20-millimeter rotary cannon, and there's a lot of high explosive tracer self-destruct ammunition for that, which is what you need for doing air defense. The problem with VADs is that there's no integrated search radar, there's no integrated track radar, so acquiring targets, hitting your targets is a little bit challenging. The Israeli variant of M163 VADs is much more sophisticated, and it can data link with external radar units. So that would be very good if the United States could have their units upgraded to that standard. I wouldn't suspect that Israel would give any themselves, but if they could get them upgraded to that standard, because they'd need to be refurbished anyway, that would be much more useful. So definitely, in my opinion, something that's worthwhile for the Department of Defense to explore providing to Ukraine, but so far it is not seem to be something that is being considered.
Okay. Well, thanks for that back and forth. It'll be interesting to see specifically what is in that package when the official announcement is made tomorrow. And by the way, I believe that my co-hosts had added as the first tweet in the nest, link to Colby's tweet on the 800 million, and I quote tweeted there is a list with more details. So continuing on updates on DPICM, DPICMs, I think I was on the fourth item back in the nest. That fourth item, a tweet from OSINT Technical, is just some background on what DPICMs are, how they work. So if you're not familiar with them and their theory of use, have a look at that OSINT Technical thread. The fifth item back is just with regard to the controversy that exists over DUD rates. And so this is actually quite an old tweet from John Ismay. It's an article that was written in the New York Times about the use of DPICMs and how the claimed DUD rates from the manufacturer didn't seem to accord with real DUD rates. And so there's been a lot of back and forth on this topic about, because that's the main risk that they pose. And this is partly why their use is banned in some countries. And so that article from the New York Times got quite a lot of attention. There was also a thread put up by General Mark Hertling about his experience, because he was referred to in that 2020 New York Times article as well. So his insights are helpful. And, occasionally my understanding is that the manufacturers will claim low single-digit dud rates, but that the New York Times article and others will argue that they're, sometimes as high as 20, in the neighborhood of 20% duds. Because, of course, then their risk is, if they don't explode on impact and they remain on the ground, then they become a risk to your own troops, but then also to civilians afterward. So the sixth item back in the nest, tweet by Shashank Joshi, I referred to this in speaking with Mr. Kofman about the fact that the United States is claiming it will pick out newly manufactured munitions with the goal to keep the dud rate to 2.35%, which is very specific. And we had a discussion with Mr. Kofman about whether that would limit the ammunition inventory available, because people are pointing to these as a supplement to artillery ammunition that, could be quite significant, but that obviously if this rate is used to limit the types of munitions sent or the recency of manufacture, then it will temper that somewhat. Wolverine, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and the submunitions, even when we fire them out here, whether we get newer ones or whatnot, anytime those are fired, and they're only fired into specific areas, because those areas, EOD, like if they get told, hey, we lost this out, like if a helicopter sling loading something, our EOD won't even go out there. They're like, hey, that gear's gone, write it off, because they will not go out there. They don't care if it's newly manufactured or it's 10, 15 years old. The dud rate on them, it's actually varies. I mean, you can have as high as I've actually was reading different articles. I read like 4 or 5 different articles about this. They have some reports where the dud rate can be up to 40%. They have some where it can be up to 15 to 14%. You get others say it's like 7%. So with the variation on all that one, the DPICM rounds is you have to be careful with what you're using for, because there are certain things that those things are awesome for. Like example, let's say you have a enemy artillery battalion or artillery regiment in the open, and you want to dump a ton of munitions on them and cause as much damage with a few amount of rounds. That's great. But here's the issue: is that if the Ukrainians were to do that, what they have to do is this: let's say they hit them at grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? They need to let all of the units know. It's like, hey, we just did a dump of DPICM on this location. So when you guys go up there, you need to be very careful when moving through that area, because of the potential of the duds, the failure rates on them. I mean, we did those. They did a regimental TOT shoot in Iraq in 2003 into Baghdad, and there was one where the Marine Corps coordinated with everybody, and then there was one that the Army did. They didn't tell anybody, and Marine units ended up going to these areas, and they saw it was a anti-personnel, a DPI submunition. They had to pull every unit back from there because they had no idea who fired it. They assumed it was the Army because there was only a couple of Marine regiments with artillery out there, but that stuff is like one of the scariest things for EOD guys to even deal with. So it's not only a, like you're saying, a civilian consideration, it is actually a military consideration, because you're not going to know how many of those DPICM munitions went off and how many were duds. And that's the scary thing about them. And the other scary thing about them is they're very sensitive. I remember back early in the war when we saw stuff about where the Russians were firing their own type of DPICM munitions. I can't remember if they were air launched or they were rocket launched. But, I think they were rocket launched. But they were showing the things where they eject them out, and then they're showing the things that some people picked them up, and I was like, what the hell? But they showed a lot of pictures of them, and some of them are just like a kind of like a greenish color, olive drab. It just depends. But the thing is, once those things are dispensed, those things are so sensitive. I mean, literally, you can go up, pick one up. Oh, it's cool. Drop it down on the ground, and it blows. And now you just lost like both your feet. And that's the huge issues, because once you do stuff like that, then you got to start worrying about like what Kampuchea has to worry about with the extensive minefields out there. Because not only now the Ukrainians have to worry about, the Russians, where they've been planting, let's say in an area they need 100 mines. That's all they required, but they put 500 mines. Well, now you got 400 extra mines, and now you have a DPICM mission that was fired in that area. That's another area that the Ukrainians or EOD guys or engineers are going to have to about clearing, not only after the war, but if they go through a certain area, they're going to have to clear them also, so that their own units can continue with offensive operations and not get popped by their own ordnance.
Well, it's always interesting to hear people's firsthand experience with them. So thanks for that, Wolverine. We generated a couple of hands, though, so we'll go to Colby and then Peter.
Thanks. I think it's just important to remember when we're talking about these cluster munitions is that Ukraine is already littered with unexploded ordnance. It's absolutely everywhere. And the Russians are sitting behind very thick, deep minefields already in their fortifications. And Ukraine very much understands the challenge that is before them with dealing with unexploded ordnance over the long term. This is not a problem that's going to be solved quickly once the war is over. And I think it's just, we've been fighting this battle for a year and a half to get Ukraine cluster munitions because they've been asking for them. And we understand that we need to level the playing field here because Russia is already pelting Ukraine with cluster munitions themselves. So there needs to be a level playing field. And it is just very unfortunate that we spent a year and a half advocating for this policy change. And now it seems like we're going to get it, but there's just going to be a new restriction on cluster munitions. They'll be given, but it has to be under a certain dud rate. We really just need to give Ukraine what they want. If they're okay with a dud rate above 2.35%, then give it to them. I'm sure they'd be probably happy with a dud rate even up to 20, 30, 40%, because even at a dud rate that high, even with the risks of that amount of UXO, the bigger problem for them is just having that percentage of the munitions not detonate on top of the Russians' heads. But even with that failure rate, it's still going to be a hell of a lot more effective in many settings than just firing conventional high explosive rounds on these masked Russian formations. And it just reduces that much the amount that their barrels are wearing out because they have to fire less ammunition to achieve the same impacts. So I certainly hope that we're not going to have this new arbitrary red line where only some small fraction of the United States' total supply of cluster munitions, which is estimated to be at least 3 million of various types, just send them everything they want. I'm sure the Ukrainian General Staff will be very happy to have all of it. And it shouldn't be the United States government, whether it's the Biden administration or Congress, setting these nonsensical red lines over what they think Ukraine should get. The United States government cannot credibly claim to be more concerned about Ukrainian civilians than the Ukrainian government. They know what's best for their people.
Well, that begs the question. I haven't had time to dig into how they came to the very specific number of 2.35, because that's very specific. And I wonder if that's driven by some underlying mechanic, because how they reached it might also dictate how flexible they are on it. But time will tell. If anybody happens to know how they got 2.35 specifically, let us know. We'll go to Peter, and then we'll go to Wolverine quickly, and then because I am hoping to cover the equipment blocks of updates before we wrap up. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to point out is that Human Rights Watch tried to make a post today about the dangers of, unexploded ordnance that are going to result of these cluster munitions, and they got ratioed. I mean, it was
Peter talking.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, he's talking.
Hey, sorry guys. Wolverine, if you can hear me, you may not hear him. You may need to cycle down.
Okay, be right back.
Sure. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so Human Rights Watch was trying to warn about the dangers that these kind of cluster munitions have for the long run. Now, there are a lot of military experts that have pointed out that, in theory, these American-provided munitions should they have a timer and they should self-detonate if they didn't explode upon landing. But again, there is this dud rate and those timers can fail. And so there will be these unexploded ordnances. I do not believe that there's the same safety on the Russian munitions, which kind of look like butterflies, they were being described before. I think it was Wolverine was describing them as kind of like these olive drab things. They look sort of like butterflies when they land. And so kids pick them up. And there have been a large number, or I should say a non-trivial number of children and civilians reported to have been casualties of those kind of Russian cluster munitions. And so, of course, we don't want to see the United States be responsible for those kind of, similar casualties. Again, there should be a safety, a higher level of safeguard by the American cluster munitions, but they're not foolproof. So I just wanted to point that out. And also, I want to make sure that people don't just, tell humanitarian organizations like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, like Ukraine needs all the munitions it gets. Like they have been working in countries for decades across the world, still cleaning up munitions decades after wars. So once we deploy these things, they will be around and will be a legacy of this war for decades to come. That's all I wanted to say.
The mine's that Peter's talking about is the PFM-1. And
the butterfly one.
Yeah, also known as the green parrot. They're basically, they do look like children's toys. I've heard numerous people, journalists, Peter, people in Ukraine, they've talked about these things. These are pretty sinister little guys that the Russians just leave everywhere and they throw into every area. I mean, cluster munitions, obviously, if they don't detonate properly, turn into land minefields. And Ukraine and Russia is probably most landmined area on Earth right now, outside of the Korean DMZ. So,
well, and further to that, the report that Peter was referring to from Human Rights Watch is now it was in my agenda. It's now the first item in the nest, and I'll note that if you look at that thread from Mary Wareham, that not only is it the Human Rights Watch report linked, but then she goes down and procedurally, to their credit, they asked the Ukrainians to give input on their report, even if you disagree with their report's conclusions. At least they asked, and so included there is the Ukrainians' response, where they still maintain the position that they did not use those munitions, and so you can see a copy of their letter. Wolverine, go ahead.
So yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened to my phone, whatever. Anyway, but I completely agree with Peter saying and random and staying stuff like that. I mean, those things we tell kids, hey, don't do this, don't do that. They're kids, and they still do it to this day. I'm so glad that like my kids are like over the age of 21, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. But the thing is that realistically, the best way that the Ukrainian military can sit there and keep the casualties down from the civilian sector when this is all over is that those combat commanders in the battalions and the batteries who are firing these munitions, they need to basically, hey, we're firing at, grid, 1 through 10, right? Whatever it is. Okay, what they need to do is they need to plot that grid. They need to assign it to higher headquarters and say, hey, we just fired a submunition field in this area. Okay, and our estimates are it's going to be from this big to this big with the amount of munitions that they fired. Now, is this going to be like the cure-all to it? No, it's not going to be. But what it will do, though, is that it will give the Ukrainian military a starting point on when they had to start going through and doing all these demining missions of the specific areas they need to work through, because not only is it harmful for civilians, but when those EOD and or combat engineers have to go out and clear these areas, those are the guys who are the most at risk in the first place, because they're literally going through an area that could have like, a 10, square meter, and there's like 22 of these submunitions there. It may be exaggeration, but you get the point I'm saying. So that's one thing that the combat commanders out there need to do, is they need to track where the submunitions are being fired at, the estimated area that they're covering, and then they need to make sure they pass that up to, there's going to have to be someone who needs to keep track of that, because that is going to be really the only way you're going to keep the casualties down. You're not going to keep them all down, but at least if you do something like that, then you're going to be able to keep it down. Because in the U.S. military, the Russians probably don't give a shit, but in the U.S. military, our engineers, when they go out and lay the mines, they actually do this like whole big grid thing and stuff like that. I would look at it, it's like Spanish and Chinese to me, but they actually do this like big diagram, and they sit there and they plot where every landmine that they put is located at. So when the next unit comes up, they hand that documentation with the next unit and say, hey, here's where our minefield is at. The next unit goes, okay, cool, we got it, and they bounce. So that's something that the Ukrainians need to, they're not going to listen to someone like me, because I'm just sort of like some little retired grunt who like fixes does whatever. But they need to look at something like that, because that can potentially keep the risk of casualties from the civilian sector and the military side down, at least to a minimum. Unlike, like I said, I always use Cambodia, because that's a lot of huge demining operations are still going on even to this day. So they don't have people, sitting here. How many years have been since the Vietnam War ended? It's almost 50 years. Well, at least for us, it's almost 50 years. But mines that are still 50 years ago, during that whole 10-year period, and that's a lot of munitions to get dumped. So they have a better idea of where everything's at, so they don't end up with something like what happened in Cambodia.
Sorry if there was a delay there. I was just preemptively correcting my mic. Anyway, thanks for that, Wolverine. I know that the mines issue, cluster munitions, is a touchy one, and so I think we're, even among a group of people who is very enthusiastic in their support for Ukraine, there are different caveats and opinions being presented here. So I appreciate that. Okay, I will probably run about 10 more minutes. I just want to finish off sort of the section of material on equipment, and then we'll wrap. In anticipation of wrapping up, I've just put a couple of additional items in the nest, and I'll highlight them now in case you're new to the spaces. We hold these spaces every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, and then every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern, to make it a little bit more convenient for our European friends. Our next conversation will be on Sunday, so the first tweet in the nest includes an invitation to that, so you can set your reminders now if you'd like to join us. The second item back in the nest is just a reminder that friends of ours are streaming this conversation to YouTube. I'd encourage you to participate here on Twitter so that you can come up and speak, request the mic if you have a question or a comment. But if you miss a conversation and want to catch up on it, or if you recall a past talk that you heard and you want to go and try and find a point again, go and check out that YouTube account, and it has the recordings of our discussions. Third item back in the nest, both by way of shameless self-promotion, but also for a good purpose. with all the ups and downs that have gone on Twitter in the last couple of days, number one, I wanted to try to start a directory of people who are involved in OSINT, interested in OSINT, on their backup accounts on other platforms. Since then, an additional platform, Threads, which is a Meta product, has launched as well. And so I put up my contact information in that tweet in the nest. The Threads link is just below in the replies because it's more recent. But the reason I do that isn't just to help you find me, but that on those platforms, I have been, fairly diligently trying to track down OSINT accounts and follow them. So if you're joining those platforms, if you look at my account and then look at my follows, you will get a head start on setting up, following OSINT accounts. So I put that there to try to help you get a start. So we'll run through updates. I'm not going to go directly in order in the nest, but to finish off the update on Ukrainian equipment, I'm going to start from the 6th item back. Most of these are just sort of news points. I don't know that they'll generate a ton of discussion, but I'll run through them anyway. So that 6th tweet back in the nest is by Michael Weiss, and it links to Ukrainian language media about the fact that Ukraine has now made a deal with a Turkish manufacturer to purchase new self-propelled guns called the Fertina, which is, any new source of equipment supply is good. I'll admit I don't recall what the delivery timeline is, in that Ukraine has put in purchase orders for several systems from other manufacturers like the Polish AHS Crab, where those orders are to take place over a series of, I think, up to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. And so I don't know whether these orders from Turkey are for a product that's
Mr. Bond, I think your mic got muted. He may have a problem with his mic. I'll just quickly note that Alexander Kamyshin is on the trip with Zelensky the last 2 days, and they are expected to head to Turkey tomorrow. So it may be that I know in Hungary they were speaking with a number of the defense production people there and expected to sign some agreements with them in Hungary, and that I would expect there may be some more agreements come out of the meetings in Turkey. Whether or not we actually get to see announcements about what those agreements are seems up in the air, especially coming out of Hungary. But specifically, we should expect to see something coming out of the Turkish meetings at some point down the line.
Also, things didn't go very well in Bulgaria.
There's that.
Hi guys, I'm back. Apologies. I don't know, my system isn't all that stable tonight. I'll have to figure out how to allocate more memory or something. I see a couple of hands are up. I'll go to the hands and then I'll do these final updates before we wrap up in just a few minutes. I think Nevada was first and then Wolverine.
I just have a quick question. Does that new Meta app have spaces like Twitter does?
Not that I've seen. I know somebody.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
We had to
It's more like a feature of Instagram that's like Twitter based. Also, it collects all your data because it's owned by Meta.
We had a discussion about Blue Sky and how apparently Blue Sky has a related feature that does host spaces. So we did one experiment with that, but I haven't seen it, as Random says. I haven't seen it yet in Threads. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. But I'm not inclined to move around too much. If anything, if there's a big split in platforms, rather than trying to produce content on like 2 or 3 different platforms, I would probably just produce it standalone and then publish it in multiple places. But Twitter seems like it's working for now, for spaces. We'll go to Wolverine and then Jane.
Yeah, it was mainly kind of concerning the Turkish howitzers. The biggest issue that I kind of see, and I somewhat have a concern with, is that Turkey gets weird, like all the time about munitions sent here, munitions is sent here, and stuff like that. And what I do think that what Ukraine should actually do is align themselves with Poland on the equipment that they're using, because Poland is one of those few Baltic countries that takes everything going on very seriously here, more than anybody else. And if the Polish are using the Crabs and the K9 Thunders, then that's what the Ukrainians should look at to fully commit themselves with as well, because a couple of different reasons. One, it's the same system used between two different countries. That means that both countries can share the knowledge for maintenance, operations. They can also set up a system for the sharing of combat stocks between both countries. And it also allows them to do unilateral training and to be using the same exact equipment. So, you don't have Ukrainians showing up who've been like on a AS-90 unit, and now they're, they have to deal, work with guys on the K9 Thunders. And this is all like future down the road stuff, because they're obviously not going to be getting them like tomorrow. But I think that's the kind of things that Ukraine needs to look at, is what are the neighbor countries, especially, like I said, Poland being one of the biggest, what are they getting for equipment? They're getting K2 Panthers. They're getting M1A1s that were old Marine Corps M1A1s, and they're getting M1A2s that are brand new, fresh off the line. Poland also has a substantial amount of the Leopard 2s. I don't remember which variant, but they do have a substantial amount. So I think what Ukraine needs to look at for further on is, what are their neighbors going to be using? And that way what it does is it helps with logistics requirements. And the more people you have using a piece of equipment, just an example, F-35, look how many countries are using it right now, and the price of them have come down so much. So, it's just that is some of the big things that Ukraine needs to look at. And I mean, okay, yeah, the Turkish right across the sea, but Poland is right next door, and who's going to give them more support probably without even, answering or asking anything.
Fair points. I think that might come down to total manufacturing capacity. There may be other strategic decisions, as in they may also want to build ties with the Turkish arms industry for strategic reasons, because it's good to have relationships with Turkey, particularly if their arms industry is developing, significant capacity. Like, it might facilitate deals with Bayraktar and similar. So there may be considerations beyond but there may be considerations beyond interoperability at play. So we'll see how many of these orders ultimately wind up being fulfilled. I'll go to Exit as co-host, and then to Jane. Go ahead, Exit.
I'm just correcting myself. I said Hungary instead of Bulgaria, and I meant Bulgaria. I am very hungry right now, and that word was in my head. My apologies.
Yeah, that was a Freudian slip there.
We'll wrap up shortly, so you can get some dinner. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I just had one thing to say regarding space's like capability. I know this may sort of seem irrelevant right now, but it's going to become more relevant, it would appear, unfortunately. Spoutable is working on a space's capability, and they are trying to roll that out in the near future. So just as a FYI, they may not be the biggest dogs in this fight right now, but my guess is that Meta Threads is going to turn into Instagram, which will be every fourth post is going to be an advertisement and get rather annoying, rather fast, and unfortunate, but just the state of play right now. So,
yeah, we'll see how it goes with those other platforms.
Yep.
You know, I'm setting up on them mainly to reserve namespace, and you know, sort of keep an eye on how they develop. At this point, I'm not planning to cross post. Like I might put the some form of the agenda tweets up on one of them, but it seems like an awful lot of work unless you're an influencer full time, right? Instead of just as a hobby. To keep
huge amount of work. Huge amount of work,
yeah.
Even if you are. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, we'll power through the last of the updates, and then we'll wrap. I appreciate everybody sticking around to hear the last few details. So I'm working from, if the Nest would cooperate with me, it's now the seventh item back in the Nest. Tweet from deaidua.org. I don't know if that's a pronounceable word. But they do a good job tracking German equipment delivers to Ukraine, so I give them credit for that. Their tweet is about reports of German equipment having to be returned for repair to Germany. And they refer to 14 of the PZH-2000, the Panzerhaubitzen self-propelled guns, and 5 of the Mars-2, which is equivalent to the M270. So they're the essentially like the tracked 12-shot carrying HIMARS. And so that's a fair proportion of the equipment they provided, having had to return for repairs. It wasn't specified what the repairs were for, whether it was damage, suffered in combat, whether it was wear and tear, or that's in the normal course, or whether some of the systems were breaking under intense use. So it's also unlikely that specific details will wind up coming out, but it is interesting looking at the repair rates. Yeah, go ahead, Wolverine.
The only thing I was saying about that was I could understand seeing the Mars-2, because even though the Mars-2 is a variant of the M270 MLRS, the Mars-2 itself has, as far as I know, has not been deployed to combat, whereas the US's M270 has been deployed to multiple combat theaters, obviously starting with Desert Storm, up until now. So that might be a reason, because they've never been put through the paces in a combat zone to see what they've had to actually deal with. And this could be kind of okay, yeah, now we know that this kind of operations, and sometimes it's just a quick modification, whether it be to a PMCS schedule or a tweak in the operating components of the vehicle itself.
Yeah, it's fair to take the positive approach that these may actually be improvements learned from real world use. So that's a fair point. Go ahead, Random. We'll go quickly though.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point about the M270, that the British did use them in Iraq in 2003, and they did send some of their M270s to Ukraine as well, along with the Germans and several other European countries. That being said, we should hurry this along, because I think Exit didn't want to think about Bulgar, so she just thought about Hungary.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, just because we've received the information that the German equipment has gone back for repair, that might be consistent with the experience of other like M270s from the UK as well. But we're at the mercy of what information is disclosed. So it's not clear whether M270s have not required similar care, or whether we just haven't been told. Last 2 or 3 points on Ukrainian equipment. The 8th item back in the Nest, tweet from Euromaidan Press, just to report that the UK has now announced they will begin training 20 Ukrainian pilots in August. There were talks about a joint European training center being opened up in June, which didn't come to pass. So it's not clear what the delay is. That's unfortunate, but it's good to hear that the UK training program will proceed. The next item back, another tweet from our friend Colby, who's, I think, had to step down. But This is an article. He tweets an article from Reuters, which notes some concern in Europe as they've established a 100 billion euro defense fund. And there's now speculation as the procurement data is starting to pile up that more than half of that 100 billion fund, 55, may actually be paid to U.S. companies, which I guess is causing some consternation in Europe that so much of their funds are going to U.S. manufacturers, but that just speaks to where the relevant industrial base is located, I think. As a final point on Ukrainian equipment, just a cool update. It's actually the third from the right, tweet by James Brown, who notes that the Japanese defense minister has come out and said that that Japan will be providing equipment to Ukraine as long as it falls in one of the areas of rescue, transport, vigilance, surveillance, minesweeping. Interestingly, that could theoretically apply to offensive or lethal kit. Presumably, it wasn't specified, but that's the speculation added by this reporter in Japan. So that's good news that additional supply to Ukraine, and interesting that Japan is very slowly changing its policies with regard to provision of military equipment generally. Kitty, go ahead.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Hoshi had several tweets about it and was quite enthusiastic about it. If you like, I can throw it up in the nest.
Sure, if you put out some material, that would be great to see.
Thanks.
Okay, last updates. I'm not going to break these out individually, but these are the updates on Russian forces, equipment and force posture. I'm starting with the fourth tweet back in the nest. It's titled Russian Forces. And so I'm only going to speak to these briefly, but the first is a report coming from Project Owl that Russia now intends to take the 14th Army Corps and to combine them with apparently the 80th and 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigades in order to form a new combined arms army. Which is an interesting structural change for those who are tracking those sort of details closely. The second item there is interesting information that there were 3 training camps Russia was using in Belarus. And some satellite imagery captured by Radio Free Europe shows that those training camps are now being dismantled, suggesting that Russia may not be conducting training in Belarus anymore, which is kind of a weird effect of Russian training capacity in Belarus on its way out, just as new camps are being built for Wagner in Belarus at the same time. You wonder why they've chosen that location for Wagner, and if the Russian training camps are being closed, why the Wagner forces didn't just continue in one of those camps. But anyway, the details are there for you. There's a report on overall plans for Russian military reorganization, and that's a report that's been put out by the Jamestown organization. So it's up there if you're into detailed unit tracking. Another report from the Jamestown org, that fourth item in the tweet. This report from Jamestown is a review of the true state of Russian arms manufacturing as of June. So I know that there are tons of friends of ours in the space who are very interested in industrial capacity, so check that one out. In this tweet, last point, interestingly, apparently the Dossier Center, which is generally Russian-based, although I think they must be operating outside Russia now, apparently have obtained thousands of documents that relate to Putin's secret armored train. And again, I know that Random and Schizo and other friends of ours have been very interested in armored trains, both in the current war and historically. So now there might be a treasure trove to see what their current armored train is like. Very last thing that I'm going to run through, seventh item back in the nest. These are the last updates on Russian force posture. So speaking to them quickly, there were reports that the Iranian-backed drone factory in Russia may now be operating. And so there's details on that from our friend Sam Bendet, who tracks drones closely. There was an article from the War Zone about a Storm Shadow that appeared to have crashed and was largely intact without detonating. And that even though it's an older missile, that isn't cutting edge, it's the technology in it could be beneficial to Russia in sort of studying how to build similar munitions. Another Warzone article is the third item down there under the heading winged bombs. So I believe these were their Fab 500 bombs, and the first photos were taken of them with their wing guidance kit, which, if I'm not mistaken, is similar to the US's JDAM, Joint Direct Aerial Munition, I think. Or no, excuse me, Joint Direct Attack Munition. And so there are details in that article on the Russian equivalent. Two last points. One, it's under the heading Strategic Aviation Exercise. Just to note that Russia is holding strategic exercises with its bombers. There are details in that article, including a large NOTAM area, which is important if you're a flight tracker to pay attention so you know what's normal, so that if you see a bunch of bombers up in the air, you'll be able to associate it with the exercise as opposed to being alarmed at it being outside normal. Finally, there is debate over whether nuclear arms have actually been transferred to Belarus. About a week ago, Lukashenko came out and said those transfers had occurred. There's some doubt. We've provided material from Nuke Strat here on Twitter and others who are doubting that, saying that imagery of the potential storage locations don't seem to suggest that enough construction has happened. There's specialized equipment that needs to exist for the nuclear weapon storage. This tweet from Pavel Podvig asserts, apparently Lukashenko came out and said that the nuclear weapons had been transported to Belarus by plane, by air, as opposed to overland. And Pavel Podvig in this tweet is saying that sounds highly unusual. They would almost always be moved by land. And so he's doubting Lukashenko's assertion there. Okay. Well, we went a fair bit longer than I expected. So I think that, actually, we have a request from a friend of ours. So let me just add this here. We'll see if Language Learner is able to join us. Hey, Language, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
We're good. I guess we've run late enough that we've ticked over into your morning.
A little bit, but it's all good. I have a rare day where I'm not running around off base, so I was sitting here eating my breakfast of mush mostly, and I saw, there's a cool little. I figured, why not tune in?
Does that include Jack Daniels in your breakfast?
Actually, Donetsk is a dry oblast, so no alcohol allowed. Crossing the border, check our car.
Well, anyway, I'm glad you're able to drop in. For those who didn't join us, Language spoke with us on Sunday about the training that he's doing of Ukrainian troops in terms of TCCC, the casualty care, and the success that he's having there, including some of his efforts to share TCCC information on his Telegram account. So it's lots of medical info that had been translated to Ukrainian, and he is promoting to the folks over there. So it was a good chat, and we have the recording. I think is still up, both on YouTube and I think if you search my account. But you join us, Language, just as we're wrapping up. So I'm glad we could see you, but maybe we'll catch you a little bit on Sunday.
Sounds good.
So I'll go to exit. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Language. I was wondering if your weather has turned from hot to very, very rainy yet.
It's about to. The mosquitoes are killer. The temperatures are severe. And I think there's certain things that are being done in advance of the projected rain, at least in the east here. Just to be perfectly blunt, because it doesn't matter. I know a group that got sent to an operation in their area ahead of schedule, because people are aware that once the rain deluges everything here, nothing's going to happen. But where that is and how that is and what that operation is, I can't talk about. But things are getting moved up in terms of schedule in some cases, and other people are saying, "Oh, well, we may have to wait till that's all done." I don't think that's going to, be a surprise to anyone that the weather does dictate things out here, and it forces people to change. Especially with these trenches, when it rains and it becomes a mud-ridden mess, you're not doing anything. I don't care who you are; it's not happening. It's just a whole mud puddle. You can't get anywhere without a really heavy, 6-wheel drive truck.
Wolverine, if you want to ask one last question, go ahead.
I was just wondering, has it gotten from 41? Has it gotten the temperature's gotten from 41 Celsius to 43 Celsius yet?
No, we haven't gotten that high. It's been mostly in the mid 30s, lower 30s, with a lot of humidity, which has been causing some issues. Also, a lot of mosquitoes, and unfortunately, just heat exhaustion and other such things.
Okay. Again, if you're able to join us on Sunday, then we'll catch up with you a bit more then. Otherwise, until then, have a good day. And so I'll just wrap up and say thank you to everybody for joining us. Thanks for sticking around to the end. We had a big crowd going because we had a terrific guest in Michael Kofman, and a pretty expansive 2-hour conversation. It sounds like he may be open to coming back and chatting with us again. So keep your eye open for that. Thanks to all the speakers. Our speakers have generally been following the war very closely since the beginning. So I'd encourage you to check out their profiles, consider giving them a follow. A lot of them have, specialize in, a particular field or another, one particular field or another. And reminder that first tweet in the nest includes the invitation to our conversation on Sunday. So you can set a reminder now. Finally, thanks to my co-hosts, to Exit and Riverside Kitty. Without your guys' help, it would be very hard to do these spaces. So hopefully we'll see you guys all on Sunday, and have a good night.